Lucy Harlow's cane caught on a crack in the cobblestone, and the world tilted sideways. Her coffee, the good kind, the one she walked 11 blocks for because the place on 5th used real vanilla, launched from her hand in a wide, stupid arc she could not see but absolutely heard. The splash, the gasp of a stranger, the particular silence that falls over a crowd when someone makes a spectacle of themselves in a night market packed with 6,000 people who all have phones. She pitched forward, hand out, reaching for anything solid. She found something solid. Her palm landed flat against a jawline, not a wall, not a pole, a face. Cold skin pulled tight over bone, a jaw clenched so hard the muscles trembled beneath her fingertips, like guitar strings wound 3 turns too tight. She should have pulled away. That was the polite thing, the expected thing, the thing a normal 24-year-old woman does when she accidentally grabs a stranger's face in public. She did not pull away. Something poured through her palm, not heat, the opposite. A cold so specific it had texture, had weight, had years behind it. This was not the cold of winter air or refrigerated skin. This was the cold of a door sealed shut from the inside, of a room where someone had turned off every light, locked every window, and sat in the dark so long they forgot what warmth meant. Lucy's fingers pressed harder, without permission from her brain. "You're in pain," she said. Not a question. Not a guess. A diagnosis, delivered with the same flat certainty she used at the clinic when her hands found the hairline fracture an X-ray missed, the torn ligament a doctor swore was just a sprain. The face beneath her hand went very, very still. Around them, the night market carried on. A vendor 3 stalls over shouted about hand-pulled noodles. A child screamed for a balloon. Bass thumped from a speaker someone had set up near the fountain, and a group of teenagers laughed at something on a phone screen, and the whole gorgeous mess of human noise churned like a river around 2 people standing perfectly still in the middle of it. The man did not speak, for 4 full seconds. Lucy counted. She was good at counting silences. They were the punctuation marks most people ignored. "You're mistaken," he said. His voice landed in her chest, like a low note on a cello. Deep. Controlled. The kind of voice that had been used to giving orders for so long it forgot how to ask questions. "I'm not," Lucy said. She pulled her hand back. Her palm tingled, pins and needles, the way a foot feels when blood returns after you've been sitting on it wrong. "But okay." She stepped back. Her cane found the ground again. She oriented herself. Fountain to the left, noodle vendor behind, music ahead, and walked away without another word. She did not look back. She could not look back. She could not look at anything. She had been blind since the day she was born, and the darkness she lived in was not a tragedy or a limitation, but simply the way her world was built, like a house, with no windows, that had very, very good doors. But her hand would not stop tingling. 3 blocks from the market, standing at a crosswalk waiting for the audio signal, she pressed her right palm against her jeans and rubbed hard, trying to scrub the sensation away. It did not leave. It sat in her skin like a splinter she could feel but not find. The crosswalk beeped. She walked, and somewhere behind her, in the thick of a night market he had no business attending, Ethan Graves stood exactly where she had left him, touching his own jaw as if checking whether it was still there. It was. He was not sure about the rest of him. Ethan had not attended a human gathering in 91 years. The last time had been a jazz club in 1935, a basement affair in a city that no longer existed in the same shape. And he had gone because a woman he loved had asked him to dance. That woman was 200 years dead, and the jazz club was a parking garage now. And Ethan had not danced since. And he was not dancing tonight either. He had come to the night market because his chest was hollow. Not metaphorically, not poetically. Hollow in the way a drum is hollow. Functional, resonant when struck, but empty at the center. He had been this way for 2 centuries. He ran a kingdom from this emptiness. He signed treaties, settled disputes, commanded armies, and buried allies. And all of it rolled through him like sound through a tunnel, present and then gone, leaving nothing behind. His advisors had begged him not to come to the surface tonight. Peter Finch, his steward, a vampire of 400 years who still ironed his own shirts because he trusted no one else to get the collar right, had stood in the doorway of the king's chamber, and listed 14 reasons the visit was inadvisable. 14, Ethan had said, pulling on a coat that cost more than most humans made in a year. Is that all? Peter had stared at him, with the expression of a man who had served the same king for 3 centuries, and was still, somehow, surprised by him. I could find more, Your Grace. Don't bother. I'm going. May I ask why? Ethan had paused at the door. The honest answer was too large and too pathetic to say out loud. The honest answer was that he had woken that evening and pressed his hand to his own chest and felt nothing. Not his heartbeat, which was slow but present. Not the weight of his responsibilities, which were enormous, but the specific nothing of a man who has been alive for so long he has forgotten what alive is supposed to feel like. Fresh air, he had said, and left. Now he stood in a night market full of humans who smelled like sweat and sugar and cheap beer. And a blind girl had put her hand on his face and told him something about himself that should not have been true.
You're in pain!
He was not in pain. He had made very certain of that. 200 years ago, in a chamber deep beneath the earth, he had performed a sealing. Not a spell exactly. Vampires did not use magic the way humans imagined it. It was closer to surgery. A precise, deliberate closing of pathways, emotional nerves, cauterized, grief receptors, shut down. The capacity to feel loss, want, joy, fury, all of it, packed into a space behind his sternum and locked with a seal that had held for 2 centuries without a crack. He had done it himself. No one helped, no one knew, except Peter, who had found him afterward on the floor of the chamber, dry-eyed and calm for the first time in weeks, and had said nothing then, and had said nothing since. The seal worked. That was its genius, and its horror. It worked perfectly. Ethan governed without passion, and therefore without error. He judged without bias, and therefore without mercy. He led without fear, and therefore without courage. He was the finest king his people had ever had. He was also, in every way that mattered, already gone. So when a blind girl touched his face in a crowded market and said, "You're in pain," with the certainty of someone reading a thermometer, the correct response was, "She's wrong." The evidence-based, centuries-tested, structurally verified response was, "She's wrong." His hand was shaking. He looked down at it. His left hand, the one that had hung at his side while she touched him, trembled with a fine, rapid vibration he had not experienced since he could not finish the thought. The seal prevented it. The memory tried to surface, hit the locked door behind his sternum, and dissolved like smoke against glass. Your Grace, one of his guards, positioned 10 feet away, and pretending to examine a stall of handmade candles, spoke without turning. We should move. Ethan closed his hand into a fist. The trembling stopped. He stepped forward, and the crowd parted for him the way crowds always did. Not because they knew what he was, but because some part of the human animal still recognized a predator, even in a nice coat. He walked for 20 minutes, through the market, past it, into the quieter streets where the city settled into its nighttime breathing. His guards followed at intervals, professional and silent. He thought about the girl's hand on his jaw. Not the touch itself. He had been touched before, by diplomats and challengers, and the occasional ambitious courtier who mistook proximity for permission. Those touches registered as data, pressure, temperature, duration. Her touch registered as something else. It registered as being found. He stopped walking. He stood on a street corner beneath a light that buzzed with the particular exhaustion of a bulb about to die, and he pressed his fist against his sternum where the seal lived, and waited for the feeling to pass. It did not pass. Lucy's apartment was a studio above a laundromat on Hester Street. The washer-dryer hum was her white noise, her lullaby, her architectural heartbeat. She had lived here for 3 years and knew every creak in the floor, every stiff spot in the windows, every particular way the pipes sang when her neighbor ran a bath at 11. She let herself in, locked the door. 2 deadbolts, a chain, a habit born from living alone in a city that did not always notice if a blind woman went missing, and stood in her kitchen with her coat still on. Her hand. She held it up in front of her face, which was a useless gesture she had never been able to break. She could not see it. She could feel it. The tingling had changed. It was not pins and needles now. It was something lower, deeper. A hum that lived in the bones of her fingers, like a tuning fork struck against something too dense to name. She had felt things in people before. That was not new. That was the whole reason she was good at her job. The whole reason Dr. Adler had hired her at the clinic straight out of her certification program, even though she was 22 and blind, and had no connections, and had shown up to the interview with coffee on her sleeve. "Your hands," Dr. Adler had said during her practical exam, watching Lucy find a stress fracture in a test patient's wrist in under 40 seconds. "What are they doing, exactly?" "Listening," Lucy had said, because that was the closest word she had. Her hands listened to bodies the way ears listen to music. Not just the notes, but the spaces between them. The places where sound should be, and was not. The silences that meant something was broken, or blocked, or held too tight. She had built a life out of this. A small, good, careful life. 14 patients a day, Tuesday soup from the deli on 3rd, always Tuesday, always the chicken and rice, because routines were the architecture that kept her world navigable. Audiobooks at night, a phone call with her old foster mother every Sunday, no family otherwise, no file worth reading. A life thin enough to fit in a folder. But she had never felt what she felt on that man's face. Pain, she had said, and she meant it, and she was right, but the word was too small. What she had felt under his skin was not pain the way a sore muscle is pain, or a broken bone is pain. It was structural, it was foundational. It was like pressing her hand against the wall of a building and feeling that the entire foundation was cracked, and the building was still standing, only because nobody had told it yet that it should have fallen. She pulled off her coat, made tea, sat at her kitchen table with both hands wrapped around the mug, letting the heat fight the cold still living in her right palm. The cold won. She went to bed at midnight. She lay in the dark, which was the same as every other moment of her life, and she flexed her right hand open and closed, trying to shake the feeling that she had touched something she was not supposed to find, something that had been hidden on purpose. Something that had been hidden for a very, very long time. 7 floors beneath the surface of a city that did not know it existed, Ethan Graves walked through the gates of the undercourt and handed his coat to a servant who had been holding coats for this particular king for 160 years. The undercourt was carved from stone that had been old when the city above was a trading post. Cathedral ceilings, columns that rose into darkness, hallways wide enough for 6 vampires to walk abreast, lit by phosphorescent moss that grew on the walls in patterns that shifted so slowly it took decades to notice. It was beautiful, in the way that deep ocean trenches are beautiful, vast and cold, and completely indifferent to whether you found it beautiful or not. Peter Finch was waiting in the antechamber. He stood the way he always stood, upright, pressed, hands behind his back, expression set to professional neutrality, with a faint undercurrent of, "I told you so." "How was the fresh air?" Peter asked. "Crowded." Peter studied him. Peter had known Ethan since before the sealing. He was one of perhaps 3 people in the kingdom who remembered what Ethan had been like before. Warmer, quicker to laugh, prone to arguments that lasted for days because he cared about things enough to fight for them. Peter remembered, and Peter kept remembering, and Peter never mentioned it, which was either loyalty or cruelty depending on the day. "You have a council session at dawn," Peter said. 3 land disputes, a trade negotiation with the Eastern faction, and Lady Cole has requested a private audience. Maggie can wait. She said you would say that. She also said to tell you, and I am quoting directly, he can wait for his own funeral if he prefers. Ethan almost smiled. Almost. The muscles of his face moved in the direction of a smile, the way a car engine turns over without catching. The motion was there. The ignition was not. "Tell her I will see her after the trade negotiation." He walked to his chambers. The door was 12 feet of solid iron, carved with the sigil of his house, a crown of thorns wrapped around a closed fist. He pressed his palm to the lock and felt the mechanism recognize him, the old magic reading his blood like a signature. The door opened. He stepped inside. The room was spare, a bed he did not need, a desk he used, a window that opened onto nothing because there was no sky down here, only stone and silence, and the faint green glow of moss that did not care whether a king slept beneath it or a beggar. He sat at his desk. He reached for the reports Peter would have left, trade figures, population counts, border disputes. His hand trembled. He stared at it. He pressed it flat against the desk and held it there until the wood absorbed the vibration. Then he picked up the first report and began to read, and the words moved through him the way everything moved through him, like wind through a hollow tree. But the trembling came back. 3 times that night, he stopped reading because his left hand shook without permission, without cause, without any reason he could name or any mechanism he could identify. The seal held. He checked. He pressed his consciousness against it the way you press a tongue against a sore tooth, a compulsive testing motion, and it was solid, intact. 2 centuries of emotional architecture, locked down and holding. So why was his hand shaking? He did not sleep. He had not needed sleep in 400 years, but he sometimes lay down and closed his eyes and let his mind go quiet, and that counterfeit rest was usually enough. Tonight he sat at his desk and read every report in the stack, and drafted replies to all of them, and reorganized the filing system Peter had maintained for decades. And when he ran out of work, he sat with his hands flat on the desk, and stared at the wall, and thought about a woman's palm on his jaw, and the absolute conviction in her voice when she said words that should not have been true. "You're in pain." Dawn came. He felt it not as light, there was no light here, but as a shift in the air, a subtle change in the magnetic hum of the stone, the way the deep earth registered the sun's position, the way a blind woman registered a man's suffering. He caught the parallel and did not like it. The council session went as all council sessions went. Ethan listened. Ethan judged. Ethan delivered verdicts that were fair and precise, and completely devoid of anything that might be called compassion or cruelty, because both of those required feeling, and he did not feel. The 3 land disputes were resolved in 40 minutes. The trade negotiation took longer because the Eastern faction's envoy was young and nervous and kept circling the same 3 points, as though repetition might make them stronger. "Your terms are acceptable with 2 modifications," Ethan said, and outlined the modifications, and the envoy nodded like a man who had expected to drown, and instead found the water was only ankle deep. After the session, Maggie Cole walked into his private study without knocking. She had been doing this for 150 years. Ethan had stopped commenting on it roughly 149 years ago. Maggie was tall, sharp-featured, and carried herself with the particular energy of a woman who could end most conversations, and some lives, before they started. She had been his second in command since the century before last. She was also the only person in the kingdom who looked at Ethan and did not see a king first. She saw the man underneath, or rather, she saw the space where the man used to be. "You went up," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk without invitation. "I did. Peter says you came back different. Peter says a great many things. Peter says your hand was shaking." Ethan looked at his hand, currently resting on the arm of his chair. It was still. It had been still all morning. Whatever had happened at the market had passed, or retreated, or hidden itself the way small animals hide when they sense a larger predator nearby. "Peter is observant," Ethan said. "It is his finest quality, and his most irritating." Maggie leaned forward. Her eyes, dark amber, old, too old for the face they lived in, searched his. "Ethan, what happened up there?" He considered the truth. He considered telling Maggie about the blind girl with the unerring hands and the flat diagnostic voice, about the cold that poured through her palm and the trembling that followed, about the way the word pain had landed in him, like a stone dropped into a well he thought had been filled with concrete. "Nothing," he said. "A crowded market. Bad noodles." Maggie looked at him the way she always did when he lied, with the expression of a woman deciding whether the lie was worth dismantling today or whether she should save her energy for a bigger fight. She saved her energy. "Simon Drake requested a formal audience last week," she said, changing subjects with the precision of a knife. Again. Ethan's expression did not change. It rarely did. But something moved behind it, deep, under the seal, in the place where reactions lived before they were cauterized. Simon Drake, faction leader. Old blood, older grudges. A man who smiled the way other people drew weapons, as a precursor to damage. What does he want? The same thing he always wants, to remind you that he exists, to test the walls. Deny the audience. Tell him the schedule is full through the quarter. That will be the third denial this year. Then he should take the hint. Maggie stood. She paused at the door. And in that pause, Ethan felt something he had not felt in a very long time, the weight of someone choosing not to say the thing they most wanted to say. Whatever did not happen at the market, she said, her back to him. Make sure it does not happen again. She left. The door closed behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Ethan sat in the silence she left behind and pressed his hand to the left side of his chest, where the seal lived, and felt it holding, solid, intact, immovable. His hand shook. Across the city, 14 stories above the earth, Lucy Harlow woke up with her right hand already flexing. She had dreamed of cold, not winter cold, not ice cold, but the specific deep earth cold of a room that had not been opened in centuries, a place where air went to forget what breathing was. She had dreamed of a door, sealed, locked from the inside, and behind it, the sound of someone not screaming, not crying, not making any noise at all. That was the worst part. The silence behind the door. The sound of someone who had stopped calling for help so long ago they had forgotten there was anyone to call. She got up, made coffee, burned her toast because the toaster had exactly 2 settings, barely warm and arson, and stood in her kitchen eating charred bread and thinking about a stranger's jaw under her hand. Her phone buzzed. A voice note from Dr. Adler. First patient at 9. Full day. That knee replacement follow-up at 2 was rescheduled to 3. And could she please stop scaring patients by diagnosing things before the scans came back? Lucy smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had been told her whole life that what she could do was impossible, and who had long ago stopped arguing and started simply doing it. She got dressed. She picked up her cane. She walked to work. The city moved around her in its usual symphony, car horns in B-flat, a bus exhaling at a stop, pigeons arguing over a bagel with the intensity of divorce lawyers, a man 3 feet to her left talking on the phone about someone named Kevin who apparently could not be trusted with the Henderson account. She navigated all of it without thinking. This was her city. She knew it by sound and smell and the particular way the air moved between buildings, and she did not need eyes to know that the light on 4th was about to change, or that the puddle on the corner of Hester and Grand was always exactly 4 inches deep after rain. She arrived at the clinic at 8:45, hung up her coat, washed her hands, always twice, always up to the elbows, a ritual that had less to do with hygiene and more to do with resetting her palms to neutral, clearing whatever residual frequencies they had picked up from the day. Today, the reset did not work. Her right hand still hummed, low and steady, like a phone vibrating in a pocket, except the phone was her bones, and the pocket was her skin, and the call was coming from a stranger, whose face she had accidentally grabbed in a night market. Her first patient was a runner with shin splints. Lucy placed her hands on his lower legs and felt the expected inflammation, the expected microstress, the expected pattern of a man who ran too far on pavement and called it training. She also felt, beneath all of that, absolutely nothing unusual. The runner's body told a clear, simple story. Pain here, cause there, solution obvious. It was almost disappointing. She worked through the morning. A dislocated shoulder that had healed slightly wrong. A lower back that had been compensating for a hip imbalance for so long, it had built a whole false architecture of muscle tension to keep itself upright. A teenager with a wrist injury, who swore she got it playing volleyball, but whose stress patterns said something closer to a fist meeting a wall. Lucy did not ask about the wall. She treated the wrist and made sure the girl saw her write down the number for the free counseling center on 8th, the one that took walk-ins and did not require parents. Lunch was a sandwich from the place next door, eaten at her desk, while her right hand ached with a cold that had no source and no name and no business still being there 14 hours after she had touched a stranger and let go. She flexed her fingers, opened, closed, opened. The hum was still there, not louder, not quieter, steady, waiting. Like a signal, like a thread connecting her to something she had not yet decided whether she wanted to find. Peter Finch had been alive for 412 years, and in all that time he had learned exactly one thing worth knowing. When a king says nothing happened, something always happened. He stood in the records hall, a long, cold room lined with shelves that held the administrative memory of a civilization most humans did not know existed, and pulled a blank file from the cabinet. He smoothed it on the desk. He picked up a pen, and he wrote, in handwriting so precise it could have been printed, a single word at the top of the page. Market. Beneath it, he wrote the date. Beneath the date, he wrote the time of the king's departure, the time of his return, and the observation that had kept Peter awake for the duration of the day. The king's left hand had been trembling when he came through the gate. Peter had served Ethan Graves for 307 years. He had been present for the war that unified the southern factions. He had been present for the treaty that ended the century of blood. He had been present for the night that Grace Ashworth died, and Ethan sealed himself shut like a mausoleum. He had seen the king hold a line against 40 attackers without a flicker of expression. He had seen the king sign death warrants for old friends without his pen wavering. He had seen the king carry a kingdom on his back for 2 centuries, with the mechanical precision of a clock that did not need winding, because it had forgotten what time meant. He had never, in 300 years, seen the king's hand shake. Peter closed the file. He locked it in the second drawer, the one that held only things he did not yet understand, and went to find the king's schedule for the following week. There would be a surface visit. Peter knew this the way he knew most things about Ethan, not because the king told him, but because he had been watching this particular man for long enough to read the silence between his sentences. He was right. 2 days later, Ethan requested civilian clothing and surface passage. "The same district?" Peter asked, keeping his voice as flat as an ironing board. "Different purpose." Peter waited. "I need a clinic," Ethan said. "Physiotherapy. Something in the neighborhood of last night's market." Peter did not ask why a creature who healed from broken bones in under an hour needed physiotherapy. He had learned, across 4 centuries of service, that the most useful response to a puzzling order was simply to execute it and pay very close attention to what happened next. He found 3 clinics within walking distance of the night market. He chose the smallest one, less exposure, fewer eyes, and booked an appointment under a name that was not Ethan's, for a shoulder complaint that did not exist. The clinic was called Healing Hands. It occupied the ground floor of a brick building on a street that smelled like coffee and motor oil, and the waiting room had 6 chairs, a dying plant, and a stack of magazines so old the celebrities on their covers had different faces now. Ethan sat in one of the 6 chairs and waited. He was aware that this was absurd. A king, the only king his people had known for 3 centuries, sitting in a plastic chair in a human clinic, pretending to have a shoulder injury, because a blind woman had touched his face in a crowd and something in him had cracked. Not the seal. The seal was intact. He had checked it 40 times in 2 days, pressing his awareness against it with the obsessive frequency of someone checking a lock they know they already locked. It held. It was fine. It was perfect. Something else had cracked. Something adjacent to the seal. Something he did not have a name for. Something that lived in the narrow gap between not feeling and not knowing how to feel. And the crack was small, but it was there, and it hummed at the same frequency as the memory of a warm palm on cold skin. The door opened. A receptionist, young, bored, gum, called the name Peter had invented. "That is me," Ethan said, standing. It was not him. It had never been anyone. He followed the receptionist down a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and lavender, and something else, something beneath the surface smells, something that lived in the walls like a signature. The treatment room was small, a padded table, a counter with bottles, a window that let in the kind of light that made dust visible, each particle a tiny planet drifting through a sunbeam galaxy. Lucy Harlow walked in. She was shorter than he remembered. Her hair was pulled back, dark and practical. She wore a clinic polo and carried herself with the particular confidence of a person who has built their own map of the world and trusts it more than anyone else's. She did not recognize him. Of course she did not. She had never seen his face, could not see his face, would never see his face. But her hand, the right one, the one that had touched his jaw, twitched at her side as she entered the room. "Hi there," she said. Her voice was warm, professional, the voice of a woman who touched strangers' broken bodies for a living, and managed to make it feel like an act of generosity. rather than an intrusion. I'm Lucy. I'll be working with you today. Shoulder, right? Right shoulder, Ethan said. His voice sounded wrong to his own ears, too careful, too controlled, the vocal equivalent of someone walking across a frozen pond and testing each step. Okay, sit on the table for me, and take off your jacket. He removed his jacket. Beneath it, he wore a dark shirt, chosen because Peter had suggested it, and Peter's suggestions were never wrong about surface world fashion. Lucy approached the table. She reached out and placed her hands on his right shoulder, her fingers settling into the muscle with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times. She went still. Her fingers stopped moving. Her breathing changed. Not faster, not slower, but differently. The way breathing changes when a person is suddenly listening very hard to something only they can hear. You again, she said. Not to him, to whatever her hands were reading beneath his skin. Ethan's chest tightened. Not the seal, something around it, the tissue of awareness that surrounded the sealed space, tightening like a fist around a stone. Excuse me? He managed. Lucy's fingers moved again, exploring his shoulder with the deliberate attention of a person searching a room for a hidden door. Sorry, thinking out loud. Your shoulder is fine, by the way. It has been bothering me for... No, it hasn't. She said it without judgment, without accusation, with the simple factual tone of a woman who was used to bodies lying to her and had long ago stopped being polite about it. There's no inflammation, no scar tissue, no impingement. Your rotator cuff is, actually, it's in better shape than most people half your age. Whatever brought you here, it wasn't your shoulder. Ethan said nothing. He had prepared a cover story. He had rehearsed it with the same care he applied to diplomatic negotiations. And now, in the presence of hands that apparently read bodies, the way scholars read ancient texts, the cover story dissolved like sugar in hot water. Lucy did not press for an explanation. Instead, she kept her hands on his shoulder and began moving them, slowly, deliberately, across his upper back, his trapezius, the muscles that ran along his spine like cables holding up a bridge. Your body is holding something, she said after a long silence. Not an injury, not tension exactly. It's more like, have you ever seen those trees that grow around a fence? The tree keeps growing, and the fence stays, and eventually the wood just absorbs the metal and grows over it, and you can't tell where the tree ends and the fence begins? I have not seen those trees. Well, that's what your body feels like it grew around something a long time ago, and now the something is part of the structure. You've been carrying it so long your muscles have built themselves around it. Her hands stopped at a point just below his left shoulder blade. She pressed there, gently, and Ethan felt a vibration move through his ribs. Not painful, not pleasant, but deeply, profoundly specific, like a key being inserted into a lock he had forgotten existed. Here, she said. It's concentrated here. Whatever it is, this is where it lives. Ethan's mouth went dry. That spot, the place beneath her fingers, was the external echo point of the seal. The seal lived in his chest, behind his sternum, sealed into the architecture of his emotional pathways. But the body was a connected system, and the pressure of a 200-year lockdown radiated outward, and the spot she had found was exactly where the tension pooled when the seal did its work. No one had ever found it before. No healer, no elder, no one in 2 centuries of hands on his body. I would like to book a follow-up, he said, and his voice came out steadier than he expected, which was its own kind of lie. Lucy stepped back. She wiped her hands on a towel, the gesture of a woman returning her instruments to neutral, and nodded. I'd recommend twice a week. Whatever is locked up in there did not get locked up overnight, and it is not coming out overnight either. Agreed. And next time, do not bother with the fake injury. Just tell reception you are here for ongoing treatment. They do not care why. Neither do I, really. I just care about what my hands find. She said it with a small smile that contained no judgment and a great deal of something Ethan had not been on the receiving end of in a very long time. Kindness, simple and undecorated, and completely unearned. He booked the follow-up before he left the building. He booked it at the front desk, while the receptionist chewed her gum and typed with 2 fingers, and he walked out of the clinic into the late afternoon light, and stood on the sidewalk and pressed his hand to the spot beneath his left shoulder blade, the spot Lucy had found, and felt it humming. It was still humming when he descended through the surface passages and returned to the undercourt. It was still humming when Peter met him at the gate, with a stack of correspondence and an expression that said, "I know you are not going to tell me what happened, so I will simply wait." "Schedule the surface visits for Tuesdays and Fridays," Ethan said, handing Peter his coat. "Same clinic, ongoing." "How long?" Ethan paused. The honest answer frightened him, and fear was an emotion the seal should have prevented, and the fact that he felt it at all was either a very good sign or a very bad one, and he could not tell which. "I do not know," he said. "As long as it takes." Peter wrote it down. He did not ask what it was. He had faith, after 3 centuries, that the answers would arrive on their own schedule, and his job was not to extract them, but to be present when they landed. The second appointment was on a Tuesday. Lucy had cleared extra time. She told the receptionist it was a complex case, which was both true and the understatement of several centuries. Ethan sat on the table. Lucy placed her hands on his back, and this time she did not search. She went directly to the spot she had found before, the echo point, the tension pool, the place where 200 years of not feeling had calcified into something that felt, under her fingers, like stone wrapped in muscle. "It's still here," she said. "I would be surprised if it were not. How long have you been carrying this?" He considered lying. The truth, 200 years, was not something a human would accept or understand. "A long time," he said. "Childhood?" "No." "Adult onset then. Something happened." "Yes." "You don't have to tell me what." "I know." "Good. Because I don't need the story. The story is in your body. Your body tells me everything I need to know, and it tells the truth, which is more than most people do when they sit on this table." She began to work, not massage, something deeper, something more intentional, something that felt less like treatment and more like negotiation. Her fingers pressed into the knot of tension around the echo point and held there, not forcing, not pushing, just present, just waiting, like a person sitting outside a closed door and letting the person inside know they were not going anywhere. Ethan felt the seal respond. Not a crack, not a break, a vibration. The seal had been perfectly still for 2 centuries, a wall of absolute silence in his chest, and now it vibrated, faintly, like a window in a house when a train passes far away. "Breathe," Lucy said. "I am breathing." "No, you are performing the mechanical act of air exchange." "I said breathe. As in, let your ribs expand. Let your diaphragm drop. Let the air go somewhere it hasn't been in a while." He tried. He took a breath that started in his throat and traveled down through his chest and hit the seal and stopped. Because for 200 years, his breath had stopped there, at the locked door, and gone no further. "There," Lucy said. "Feel that? That stop, right there. That's what I'm talking about. Something in you has drawn a line, and everything above it gets to function, and everything below it is closed for business." Ethan said nothing, because she was exactly, terrifyingly right. "I've seen this before," she continued, her hands still working, still holding, still waiting. "Not like this. Never this deep, never this old, but I've seen it. People who go through something so big their body just walls it off, builds a dam, and the dam holds, and they function, and everyone thinks they are fine because they are upright and breathing and getting through the day. But underneath the dam, everything is still there. It does not go away just because you stopped feeling it." Her voice had changed, not softer, fuller. She was speaking from a place of recognition, not just professional assessment, and Ethan wondered, for the first time, what this woman's hands had found in her own body, in her own life, that gave her this particular knowledge. "I can work on this," she said. "Slowly, layer by layer. But I need you to understand something before we start. Whatever is behind that wall, it's going to come out. Not all at once. Piece by piece. And you might not like what's in there. People usually don't. I understand. Do you? Because I have had patients walk out of here after the first real release and never come back. Not because the treatment didn't work, but because it did. Feeling what you've been not feeling is not a relief. It is a reckoning." The word landed in the quiet room like a dropped glass. Reckoning. Ethan turned it over in his mind, this word that meant both an accounting and a confrontation, and decided that a man who had ruled a kingdom for 3 centuries without feeling a single genuine emotion, was long overdue for both. "I will come back," he said. Lucy nodded. She removed her hands. The session was over. The echo point still hummed, and the seal still vibrated, and Ethan walked out of the clinic and into the fading daylight feeling, for the first time in 200 years, that something inside him had shifted. Not broken, not opened. Shifted. Like a door that had been painted shut for so long everyone forgot it was a door, and someone had just scraped away enough paint to reveal the outline of the hinges. He returned to the undercourt. He attended a council session. He reviewed border reports and trade agreements and a petition from a citizen who wanted permission to marry a human, which required special dispensation and a 6-month integration protocol. He approved the petition. Peter noticed. Peter noticed because, in 200 years, Ethan had never approved a cross-species marriage petition. He had denied them, not out of prejudice, but out of the same blank, procedural logic he applied to everything. The protocols were unclear. The risks were present. The answer, by default, was no. Today the answer was yes. "Your Grace," Peter said, hovering in the doorway of the study, with the petition in his hand. "Shall I process this in the standard fashion?" "Yes." "You are aware this is a marriage petition?" "I am aware." "A cross-species marriage petition." "I can read, Peter." Peter looked at the petition. He looked at the king. He saw something in Ethan's face that he had not seen in 200 years. Not an expression, exactly, but the ghost of one, the faintest trace of something living behind the mask of perfect governance. He processed the petition. He filed it. He added a note to the file in the second drawer, the one that held things he did not yet understand. And the note said, "He approved a marriage. Something is changing." Something was changing. In a small clinic on a street that smelled like coffee and motor oil, a blind woman washed her hands up to the elbows and dried them on a clean towel and stood in the empty treatment room for a long time, staring at nothing. Not because she could not see, but because what she was looking at was internal. The thing she had felt beneath his skin, the wall, the dam, the sealed door. She had told him she had seen it before, and that was true. She had felt versions of it in dozens of patients. The muscular armor that grief builds, the postural fortress that trauma constructs. But this was different. This was not armor. This was architecture. This was a structure so old and so deliberate, it had become part of the building itself, load-bearing, essential. If she removed it wrong, too fast, too carelessly, the whole structure might come down. She dried her hands a second time, even though they were already dry. Her right palm still hummed. She was beginning to think it might never stop. The undercourt had its own weather. Not rain or wind, but shifts in pressure that moved through the stone corridors, like moods through a crowd. When the court was calm, the air held still, warm, almost gentle. When tension gathered, the stone sweated, and the phosphorescent moss dimmed to a bruised, greenish dark that made shadows look like they had opinions. Tonight the moss was dim. Maggie Cole stood at the window of her quarters, a window that opened onto the grand gallery, 300 feet of carved stone where the court gathered for ceremonies and announcements and the occasional execution, though those had become rare under Ethan's reign, mostly because executing people required feeling something about what they had done, and Ethan had not felt anything about anything in a very long time. She watched the gallery below, empty now, the stone floor polished to a mirror finish by centuries of feet. She could see her own reflection in it from here, a tall, angular figure standing perfectly still, watching nothing, thinking about everything. She had served Ethan for 153 years. She had been his strategist during the Consolidation Wars, his negotiator during the Eastern Accords, his wall between the crown and every faction leader who thought ambition was the same as qualification. She was good at her job in the way that a surgeon is good at cutting, precisely, without hesitation, and with the understanding that the thing she was saving might not survive the operation. She was also the only person alive who had known Grace Ashworth. Not well. Few people had known Grace well. She was a quiet woman, a human woman, with brown hair and a laugh that sounded like a question, and a habit of reading books in languages she was still learning, mouthing the words while Ethan watched her from across the room, with an expression that Maggie had never seen on his face before or since. Love. Actual, specific, ruinous love. The kind that rewrites a person's architecture from the inside. The kind that makes a king sit on the floor of a library because his bonded is sitting on the floor. And the floor is where she is, so the floor is where he wants to be. Grace had been dead for 203 years, and Maggie still remembered the sound Ethan made when the bond severed. Not a scream, not a cry. A sound like air being pulled out of a room. A vacuum, a void. The sound of a space that had been full becoming instantly, permanently empty. He had sealed himself within the week. Maggie had found out after. Peter had told her, standing in this same corridor, his voice as flat and controlled as pressed linen, and Maggie had listened and nodded, and walked back to her quarters, and sat in this same spot, and stared at the same empty gallery, and tried to feel angry about it, and found that she could not, because she understood. She understood what it was to lose something so completely that the only survivable response was to stop being the person who had lost it. She did not approve of the seal. She had never approved, but she understood. Now something was shifting. The king was visiting the surface twice a week. Peter was being typically, maddeningly circumspect about the details, but the effects were visible to anyone who knew where to look, and Maggie had been looking at Ethan Graves for a century and a half. He had approved a marriage petition. He had lingered at a council session 5 minutes past its scheduled end, listening to a citizen's complaint about water access with something that looked, from a certain angle, like interest. He had asked Peter about the noodle vendor at the night market, not an order, not a directive, just a question, idle and purposeless, the kind of question a person asks when they are curious about the world rather than merely managing it. These were small things, individually, meaningless. Collectively, they formed a pattern that Maggie recognized the way a general recognizes troop movements on a distant ridge, too far away to identify individually, close enough to know something was mobilizing. She was not the only one who noticed. Simon Drake had requested a formal audience for the 4th time in 6 months. The first 3 denials had been procedural. The 4th carried a different weight, the weight of a man who was no longer asking because he expected to be received, but because he wanted the denial on record. Maggie knew Simon. She had known him for longer than she had known Ethan, back when Simon was a young soldier with bright ideas and a talent for making people believe he was on their side, right up until the moment he was not. He had aged into something harder, a faction leader who controlled 30% of the Eastern Territory, and maintained his position not through loyalty, but through the precise, surgical application of leverage. He wanted the crown. He had always wanted the crown, and he had been patient about it, because patience was the one virtue that outlived all others, in a species that measured time in centuries rather than decades. A king who felt nothing was predictable. A king who felt nothing made decisions based on logic, and logic was a map Simon could read. But a king who was beginning to feel, that was a variable. Variables made Simon uncomfortable, and when Simon was uncomfortable, he started planning. Maggie poured herself a glass of the dark wine they kept in the lower cellars, the kind made from grapes that grew in underground gardens fed by phosphorescent light, and it tasted like earth and time, and the particular mineral patience of things that grew in the dark. She would need to speak to Ethan again. Not about the surface visits. She could not stop those, and she was not sure she wanted to, but about Simon, about the pattern she was watching develop, about the fact that a king, rediscovering his capacity to feel, was a beautiful thing, and also, in the current political climate, an extraordinarily dangerous one. She would speak to him tomorrow. Tonight she stood at her window and watched the empty gallery, and thought about Grace Ashworth, reading a French novel on the floor of a library, and a king who sat beside her, because the floor was where she was. The 3rd appointment was different. Lucy could feel it before her hands even touched him. Something in the air of the treatment room had changed. Not the temperature, not the smell, but the density. Standing near this man was like standing near a deep body of water. The surface was calm. The depth was immeasurable. "How have you been since Tuesday?" she asked, settling into the routine of their sessions, the way a musician settles into a familiar piece. "Functional." "That is not what I asked." A pause. She heard him breathe. That careful, controlled breath that stopped at the invisible line in his chest. The one she could feel, but could not see, and could not explain. I approved something at work that I would normally have denied, he said. I am not certain why. How did it feel? Another pause. Longer. Lucy waited. She was extraordinarily good at waiting. When you lived in darkness, you learned that silence was not empty. It was full of things that needed time to arrive. I do not know how it felt, he said. I registered that I had made a different decision than I would have made previously. I noted it. I moved on. But I have been thinking about it since, which is unusual. I do not typically think about decisions after they are made. Lucy placed her hands on his back. The echo point was there, unchanged, a knot of ancient tension, that her fingers knew the way a reader's fingers know Braille, by touch, by pressure, by the meaning hidden in the texture. That's good, she said, thinking about it afterward. That means something is reaching the surface, not the emotion itself, not yet, but the awareness that an emotion should be there. It is like hearing music through a wall. You cannot make out the song, but you know there is a song. She worked in silence for a while. Her hands moved along his spine, reading the story his body told, the centuries of held posture, the architecture of suppression, the way his muscles had learned to compensate for the absence of feeling the way a city learns to compensate for the absence of a river, rerouting its whole infrastructure around the dry bed. She found something new. Between the fourth and fifth ribs on his left side, just beneath the echo point, there was a second layer, deeper, older. If the echo point was the surface of a lake, this was the bottom, dark, cold, pressurized, holding something so heavy, it had sunk past the point of retrieval. There is more here than I thought, she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. More? Under the first layer, there is something else, deeper. It feels older. Like the first layer is a wall, and behind the wall is another wall, and behind that wall is the actual room. She felt his body tense under her hands, not the normal tension of a patient bracing against pressure, but a deeper, structural tension, the kind that lived in bone rather than muscle, the kind that said, "Do not open that door." "Can you describe what the deeper layer feels like?" he asked, and his voice was very controlled and very even, and very much the voice of a man who already knew the answer and was testing whether she knew it too. Lucy pressed her fingers gently into the space between his ribs. The deeper layer pulsed under her touch, a slow, rhythmic pressure that felt nothing like a heartbeat, and everything like a locked door being tested by whatever lived behind it. "It feels like grief," she said. "Old grief. The kind that has been sitting in one place for so long it has become part of the geology, not a feeling anymore, a feature, a permanent installation." He did not respond. "I am not going to ask you what happened," she continued. "I told you, I do not need the story. But I need you to know that this is here, and it is under pressure, and whatever system you built to contain it is working. But it is working the way a dam works, when the water level has been rising for years, and no one has checked the foundation. The foundation is solid. The foundation is tired." The room was very quiet. Outside, the city hummed its mechanical song. Inside, two people sat with the knowledge that something enormous lived in the space between them, something that had been locked away for longer than the building they sat in had existed. Lucy removed her hands. She wiped them on the towel. Her right palm screamed, not with pain, but with information, with the overwhelming volume of what it had just read, like a radio tuned to a frequency that broadcast nothing but one continuous, centuries-long note of loss. "Same time Friday?" she asked. "Same time Friday." He left. Lucy stood in the treatment room and pressed both palms flat against the wall, the actual wall, the plaster and brick wall, the wall that was just a wall and held nothing but insulation and wiring, and breathed. Her hands shook. Not the hum, not the tingle, a shake, the kind that came after touching something so vast and so compressed that the contact left her own body vibrating with sympathetic resonance. She had touched hundreds of patients, thousands. She had felt fractures and tears, and the hidden architectures of compensated injuries, and she had never, not once, encountered anything that left her hands shaking afterward. This man was different, not in degree, in kind. Whatever lived inside him was not a human-scale problem. It was something else entirely, larger, deeper, older than any injury a human body could sustain. She filed this observation in the part of her mind where she kept things she could feel, but could not explain, a cabinet that had been growing fuller her entire life, and that she had long ago stopped trying to empty. The fourth session, the fifth, the sixth. They fell into a rhythm. Tuesdays and Fridays, always the last appointment of the day, always the same room, always the same silence, as Lucy's hands mapped the territory of whatever lived inside this man's body. She learned his patterns, the way his breathing stopped at the invisible line, the way the echo point tightened when her questions got too close to something he was not ready to discuss, the way his hands, large, capable, hands that moved with the precision of someone accustomed to control, would clench and release when she worked near the deeper layer, the one that pulsed with old grief like a buried heartbeat. She also learned the things his body told her that his words did not. His skin was too cold, not illness cold, a different cold, a constitutional cold, as if his body ran at a lower temperature than any human she had ever touched. His pulse was slow, not athlete slow, glacial slow, so slow she kept losing it, her fingers pressing and searching and pressing again, convinced she had missed it until it arrived. One massive beat followed by a silence long enough to park a bus in. His muscles did not behave like human muscles. They were denser, packed tighter, responsive in ways that suggested a body that had been refined by something other than exercise, something genetic, something fundamental, something she could not name, but could feel the way you feel the depth of a pool by the pressure on your eardrums. She did not ask. She catalogued. She treated what she could treat. She worked at the edges of the sealed space, loosening the surrounding tissue, releasing the compensatory tension that had built up around the lock, like scar tissue around an implant, and she waited. She was good at waiting. On the sixth session, something changed. Her hands were on his back, working the familiar territory of the echo point, when she felt a shift, not in the muscle, not in the tension, but in the seal itself. The deep structure she had been circling for 3 weeks moved, fractionally. A millimeter of give in something that had been immovable since before she was born. Lucy pressed, gently, not forcing, holding. The seal pulsed. Not the slow, patient pulse of the grief layer beneath it. A different pulse, sharp, immediate, reactive. The pulse of a system that had detected an intrusion and was deciding whether to resist or allow. Lucy held her breath and kept her hands exactly where they were and did absolutely nothing, which was the hardest thing a healer could do. Nothing. When every instinct said push, said press, said find out what's in there. The pulse came again, stronger. She felt it move through his ribs, through his intercostal muscles, through the architecture of a body that had been locked down for 2 centuries, and it traveled up through her fingers, and into her hands, and up her arms, and she felt it in her own chest, a sympathetic vibration, a resonance, as if her body was a tuning fork, and his grief had just found its pitch. Ethan's breathing changed. The invisible line, the point where his breath stopped and went no further, moved. Down. Just slightly. A centimeter of new territory. Air reaching a place it had not reached in 200 years. He made a sound, not a word, not a gasp. A sound that lived in the space between those things. The sound of a man feeling something he had not felt in so long he did not recognize it. The way you might not recognize your own face after decades without a mirror. Stay with it, Lucy said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. Whatever you are feeling right now, do not fight it. Do not name it. Just let it be there. He breathed. The breath went deeper than it had ever gone in her presence. Past the line, past the barrier, into the sealed space. And she felt the seal respond. Not breaking, not cracking, but acknowledging. Vibrating. Recognizing that something was touching it from the outside for the first time since it was built. Then it was over. The seal settled. The echo point returned to its baseline tension. Ethan's breathing resumed its controlled, shallow pattern. But something had changed. Lucy could feel it in the air of the room, in the texture of his silence, in the way his hands unclenched and rested on his thighs, with a looseness they had not had before. Something had cracked. Not the seal. Something around the seal, a wall around a wall, a defense built to protect a defense, and the outer one had developed the thinnest hairline fracture. "How do you feel?" Lucy asked. He was quiet for a long time. Lucy let the silence stretch. She heard the clock on the wall, tick, 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 and the distant sound of traffic, and the hum of the building's old heating system, and beneath all of that, the pulse of the man sitting on her table, slow and deep and carrying, for the first time, the faintest undertone of something that might have been surprise. "I do not know," he said. "That is not a deflection. I genuinely do not know. Something happened. Something moved. I cannot describe it more precisely than that." "You don't need to describe it. Your body described it just fine." She stepped back. She washed her hands. The cold in her right palm had intensified, not unpleasantly, but unmistakably. A deep bone cold that pulsed in time with something she could not see but could absolutely feel. He booked the next appointment. He always booked the next appointment, and he walked out of the clinic into the evening, and she stood in the empty treatment room, with her hands under warm water, and watched, through the window she could not see through, the particular quality of nothing that was her permanent view of the world. But in her mind's eye, in the space where she constructed images from sound and touch, and the rich, complex data of a life lived without sight, she saw him. She saw the sealed door inside his chest. She saw the layers of defense built around it. She saw the hairline crack. And she saw, for the first time, the faintest glow of light behind the door. Something alive, something waiting, something that had been locked in the dark for 200 years, and had not died, and had not stopped waiting, and was now, for the first time, aware that someone was trying to find it. Her hands shook under the water. She was going to need a bigger towel. The fifth session started like the others. Ethan sat on the table. Lucy placed her hands on his back. The echo point was there. The grief layer was there. The hairline crack from the previous session was there. Still hairline, still thin, but present, like a pencil line drawn on concrete. Lucy worked the surrounding tissue for 20 minutes, loosening the compensatory structures, creating space for the sealed area to exist without the crushing pressure of 2 centuries of architectural defense. She was methodical, patient. She worked the way a locksmith works, not forcing, not breaking, but understanding the mechanism well enough to let it open on its own terms. She reached the echo point. She held there. The seal vibrated its recognition. "Hello. You again." Same answer as last time. No entry. And Lucy held and breathed and waited. "Tell me about your breathing," she said. "What about it? When did it change? When did you start breathing like this? Shallow, controlled, like you're rationing air." He was quiet. She counted the silence. 7 seconds, 8, 9, and she was about to move on when he spoke. "I do not remember a time when I breathed differently. Your body does. My body is wrong. Your body has never been wrong about anything, since I started touching it. Your body is the most honest thing in this room, and I include myself in that statement." She shifted her hands downward, following a line of tension that ran from the echo point to a place just below his collarbone, on the left side. This was new territory. She had circled it in previous sessions but never approached directly, because every time she moved toward it, his body's tension increased in a way that said "not yet," with the quiet authority of a closed gate. Today the gate was open, not wide, not inviting, but open the way a door is open, when someone has forgotten to lock it, accidentally, temporarily, a window of opportunity that might close at any moment. Lucy moved through it. Her fingers found the space beneath his collarbone, and the world tilted. Not the room, not the table, not any physical thing she could point to and say that moved. But the world, her internal world, the one she built from sound and sensation, the one she navigated with her hands and her ears, and her terrifyingly precise sense of what was and was not present in another person's body. That world tilted, and she fell into something she had never felt before. The seal was here. Not the echo point. Not the surrounding architecture. The seal itself. The actual structure. The locked door. It sat beneath his collarbone like a stone set into a riverbed, worn smooth by the current of centuries, embedded so deeply into his body's structure that removing it would be like removing a foundation stone from a cathedral. Theoretically possible, practically catastrophic. Lucy's breath caught. The seal was not what she expected. She had imagined. In the non-visual way she imagined everything, through sensation and spatial reasoning, and the rich, tactile language of touch. Something hard. Something rigid. A wall, a dam, a locked door. It was none of those things. It was a knot. An impossibly dense, impossibly old knot of... She did not have a word for it. Energy was too vague. Emotion was too simple. It was a knot of everything this man had ever felt, tied so tightly and so deliberately that the individual strands had fused together into a single mass, a singularity of compressed human experience that pulsed beneath her fingers with a slow, heavy rhythm that felt older than the building, older than the city, older than anything she had ever touched. She pressed, just barely. A pressure so light it was less than the weight of a resting hand. The knot responded. Something moved through it, a wave, a ripple, a detonation in miniature, and she felt it travel through his ribs and up through his spine and into his shoulders, and Ethan gasped. Not a clinical gasp, not the gasp of a patient surprised by pressure. A gasp that came from somewhere so deep inside him that it carried 200 years of silence with it. A sound like air rushing into a room that had been vacuum-sealed since the turn of the 19th century. His eyes changed. She could not see them, but she felt it. A shift in the energy of his face. A redistribution of tension that said something fundamental had just rearranged itself behind his eyes. Every glass surface in the clinic cracked. The window behind Lucy. The jar of cotton swabs on the counter. The screen of the clock on the wall. The glass panel in the door that separated the treatment room from the hallway. All of them, simultaneously, with a sound like ice fracturing on a lake. A sharp, branching, crystalline crack that spread across every pane and panel in a web of fracture lines. Lucy heard it. The sound was extraordinary. Not a single break, but a symphony of breaking. A dozen glass voices shattering in harmony. She did not flinch. She was blind. She did not see the cracks. She did not see Ethan's eyes, which had gone black, pupil swallowing iris swallowing white, a darkness so complete it was less like a color and more like an absence, a window into the void behind the seal. She did not see the moss-green light that flickered across his skin for an instant, the bioluminescent echo of a nature that was not human, not remotely human, not anything she had a reference frame for. She felt his heart beat. One massive, slamming beat, the first real heartbeat she had felt from him. Not the distant glacial pulse she had been tracking, but a heartbeat, a real one, the kind that said, "I am alive and I am here, and I have been waiting to say this for 200 years. "There it is," she whispered. Ethan pulled away. Not roughly, he did not grab her hands or shove her back, but his body removed itself from her touch with the swift, precise efficiency of a system engaging emergency protocols. One moment her fingers were on the seal. The next, he was standing, 2 feet away, breathing hard, his hands at his sides in fists so tight the tendons stood out like cables. "What did you do?" His voice was wrong. Too many frequencies. Too much depth. It sounded like his voice had been layered with another voice, one that lived beneath the first, the way the grief layer lived beneath the echo point. "I found it," Lucy said. She was calm. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady, and she stood her ground with the quiet certainty of a woman who had spent her life trusting what her hands told her, even when what they told her was impossible. "The center of it, the thing you locked away. It's right there, under your collarbone, and it's been waiting for someone to find it. You should not have. I didn't do anything. I touched it. That is all. One touch, barely any pressure, and it responded like that." She gestured at the room, the cracked glass, the scattered cotton swabs, the clock that had stopped, and the gesture was pointed, even though she could not see the damage herself. "Whatever is in there, it wants out. Not because I am forcing it, because it has been held in too long, and it is tired, and it felt someone's hand on the door and it pushed." Ethan stood in the center of the room, with cracked glass at his feet, and his eyes slowly returning to normal, the black receding like a tide pulling back from a shore, the iris resurfacing, the white returning. He looked at the damage. He looked at the blind woman standing 3 feet from him, with shaking hands, and a steady voice, and absolutely no idea what she had just witnessed, because she lived in a world where seeing was not the dominant sense, and the evidence of his nature, The black eyes, the green glow, the inhuman pulse, had passed her by entirely. She did not know what he was. She only knew what he carried. "I need to leave," he said. "Okay. I will not be booking a follow-up." "Okay." He picked up his jacket. He walked to the door. He put his hand on the handle, which was not cracked, which was metal, which held. "Whatever just happened," Lucy said to his back, "is going to keep happening. With or without me. I did not start this. You walked into my clinic with something that has been trying to get out for longer than I have been alive. And all I did was listen to it. It does not need my permission to continue. It has yours. It has always had yours. You built the lock, and you hold the key. And somewhere in the last 3 weeks, you turned it." He stood at the door with his hand on the handle and his back to her, and said nothing for 10 seconds. Then he left. Lucy stood in the broken room and breathed. The receptionist appeared in the doorway. Gum paused mid-chew, staring at the cracked glass with an expression of professional bewilderment. "What happened in here?" "Thermal shock," Lucy said, which was not true, but was the kind of thing that sounded true enough for a receptionist to type into an incident report without asking further questions. "All of them? At the same time?" "Bad batch of glass." The receptionist looked at the window, the clock, the door panel, the jar. She chewed her gum once, slowly, and left to file the report. Lucy knelt and felt for the glass on the floor. She found a piece, smooth on one side, sharp on the other, the fracture line running through it like a river on a map. She held it in her palm and turned it over and over, feeling the evidence of something she could not see, and could not name, and could not explain. Her right hand burned. Not the hum, not the tingle, not the cold. A heat, a new heat. As if the prolonged contact with whatever lived behind the seal had changed the frequency of the signal her hand had been carrying since the night market, upgraded it from a background hum to a targeted broadcast. Something was different now. Something was connected. She put the glass piece in her pocket and cleaned the room and locked up the clinic and walked home through the evening city, her cane tapping its steady rhythm, her hand burning in her coat pocket, and she did not think about the fact that she had just touched something that cracked every piece of glass in her room without anything she could identify as a physical cause. She thought about the gasp, that one sound, air rushing into a sealed space for the first time in how long? He had said a long time. Her hands said longer than that. Her hands said a kind of long that did not fit inside the word long, a duration that stretched past what a human body should be able to contain. She thought about his pulse, one beat, one massive, world-shaking beat, and then the retreat, the resealing, the return to that glacial, barely there rhythm. She thought about the fact that his skin was too cold, and his pulse was too slow, and his muscles were too dense, and his grief was too old, and every piece of data her hands had collected over 3 weeks pointed toward a conclusion that her rational mind would not let her reach, because it was impossible. She climbed the stairs to her apartment. She unlocked her door. She fed the cat, a tabby named Decimal who had appeared on her fire escape 6 months ago and refused to leave, and sat at her kitchen table and placed both hands flat on the surface and let them tremble. They trembled for a long time. Decimal jumped onto the table and pressed his head against her wrist, which was his way of saying, "I am here, and I do not understand what is wrong, but I am here." And Lucy scratched behind his ears and listened to him purr, and let the trembling slow to a stop. He was not coming back. He had said so. He had walked out with the controlled precision of a man sealing a door behind him, and she had let him go because she was a healer, not a jailer, and you could not force a person to face what they were not ready to face. But her hand burned. And somewhere beneath the city, in a kingdom she did not know existed, Ethan Graves stood in his chambers, with his palm pressed against the seal beneath his collarbone, and felt, for the first time in 200 years, the edges of something moving behind it. Not emotion, not yet. Something before emotion, the awareness of a space that should contain emotion and did not. The recognition of an absence so fundamental it had become invisible, like the silence in a room where someone has stopped breathing, and no one has noticed, because the television is still on, and the clock is still ticking, and the business of being alive continues, without the one thing that makes it worth the effort. He pressed harder. The seal held. Of course it held. He had built it to hold against anything. Against time, against memory, against the kind of loss that turns a person inside out and leaves them standing in the wreckage of themselves wondering which pieces to pick up first. But the edges moved. The edges, where the seal met the living tissue of his emotional capacity, where the locked door met the frame, where the dead space met the alive space. Those edges vibrated with a new frequency, and the frequency was hers. Lucy, her hands, her voice saying, "There it is," with the calm certainty of a woman who had found what she was looking for and was not afraid of it. She was not afraid. That was the part he could not stop thinking about. The glass cracked. The room broke. Every surface that could shatter did shatter. And she stood 3 feet away with trembling hands and a steady voice, and she was not afraid of what she had found in him. Everyone else was afraid of him. His court feared his authority. His enemies feared his power. His allies feared his judgment. Peter feared his silence. Maggie feared his emptiness. Simon Drake feared his unpredictability. Or, more precisely, feared what would happen if unpredictability were replaced by something more dangerous, like feeling. Lucy feared none of it. Lucy heard the glass break and called it thermal shock, and knelt to clean up and put a piece of the evidence in her pocket, like a scientist collecting a sample. He was terrified. Not of her, of the door she had touched, of the thing behind it, of the 200 years of unfelt everything, waiting on the other side of a lock he had built with his own hands, and his own will, and his own desperate, animal need to survive the unsurvivable. He had sealed himself to survive grace, to survive the severing, to survive the specific, total, nerve-by-nerve destruction of a bond that had been woven into every cell of his body for 50 years. When Grace died, the bond did not simply end. It tore. It ripped through him, like a wire pulled through muscle. Every memory, every sensation, every moment of 50 years of shared existence became a wound, and the wounds were not metaphorical. They were physical. They were cellular. They were the kind of damage that kills. He should have died. Most vampires who lose a bonded do die. The severing is too much. The nervous system shuts down. The heart, already slow, already barely committed to the project of pumping, simply stops. Not out of grief, but out of structural failure. The way a building collapses when you remove a load-bearing wall. Ethan did not die. He sealed. He locked every wound behind a wall of his own making, and the wall held, and he lived. And the price of living was never feeling anything again. That had been the deal. That had been the terms. Life for sensation. Existence for experience. A crown maintained, a kingdom preserved, a species governed, in exchange for the small matter of being completely, permanently, functionally hollow. A blind woman had put her hand on the wall, and the wall had cracked. He pressed his palm harder against his chest, and felt the seal vibrate, and closed his eyes, and stood in the dark of his chamber, and breathed the shallow, controlled breath that never went past the line, and thought, "I cannot go back." His hand shook. He went back. 3 weeks later, 21 days of increasingly unstable equilibrium, of emotions surfacing like bubbles in thick liquid, not breaking through, not fully forming, but rising, present, detectable. He caught himself listening to music. Peter had been playing something on the old phonograph in the records hall, a habit Peter maintained out of nostalgia for an era when music was a physical object you held in your hands, and Ethan had paused in the corridor and listened, not heard, listened, the way you listen when music is reaching a part of you that has been deaf for 200 years. He caught himself angry. A council session, a trade dispute, a faction representative who lied about grain shipments with such casual disrespect that Ethan's jaw clenched and his hand found the arm of his chair and gripped it hard enough to crack the wood. He caught himself looking at the sky. The undercourt had no sky, but the grand gallery had a ceiling carved to mimic one. Clouds and stars rendered in stone by artisans who had been dead for 500 years. And Ethan stood beneath it one evening and looked up and felt, for the first time in 2 centuries, the specific ache of missing something he had once loved. The sky. He missed the sky. The seal was leaking. Not breaking, not failing, leaking. The edges, the places Lucy had touched, the boundaries she had softened, the borders she had made slightly less absolute, were allowing the smallest quantities of feeling to seep through. Not the full force of what was stored behind the seal. Not the 200 years of grief and rage and love and terror that lived in the locked room, but drops. Individual, isolated drops of emotion, landing in his consciousness like rain on dry earth. Surprising, disorienting, and absolutely impossible to ignore. He walked into the clinic on a Tuesday afternoon without an appointment. The receptionist, different gum, same expression, looked up and said, "He's back." Lucy appeared in the hallway. She stood very still for a moment. Reading him, he realized, the way she read everything, with her whole body, her whole attention, her hands already twitching at her sides with the anticipation of contact. "I said I would not come back," he said. "I know. I lied. I know that too." She led him to the treatment room. New glass in the window. New clock on the wall. New jar for the cotton swabs. The room had been rebuilt around the damage he had caused, and it carried on as if nothing had happened, and there was something in that, in the quiet repair, the unhysterical continuation, that made his throat tight with something he could not name. He sat on the table. She placed her hands on his back. "It's leaking," she said, within 10 seconds. "Yes. How bad?" "I felt anger at a meeting. I listened to music. I looked at a ceiling and missed the sky." "That does not sound bad." "It is. Because those are the small things. And the small things are getting through, which means the big things are next. And the big things are, I do not have a comparison that does not sound dramatic." "Then be dramatic," he breathed. "The big things will destroy me." Lucy's hands stopped moving. She stood behind him, palms flat on his back, and he felt her processing this, not judging, not reassuring, not offering the empty comfort of "it will be fine." Processing. The way a structural engineer processes a report that says the bridge is holding but the cables are fraying. "Okay," she said, "then we do this carefully. Layer by layer, the way I said. We do not open the door. We ease the pressure behind it, so that when it does open, and it will open, it is already opening. It does not blow the whole building down. And if you cannot control it, I have never been able to control it. This has never been about control. This has been about presence. I am here. My hands are here. And whatever is behind that door, it is not going to come out into an empty room. It is going to come out into a room where someone is standing and paying attention and not running away." She resumed. Her hands moved to the seal. She held there, palms flat, barely touching, and the seal vibrated its recognition, and the grief layer pulsed its slow, heavy rhythm, and the room held its breath. And Ethan closed his eyes and breathed past the line. 1 centimeter, 2, the deepest breath he had taken in 2 centuries, and felt, for the first time, the first real drop of grief fall through the crack in the wall and land in his chest like a coal. 1 drop. It burned. 3 weeks passed. The drops became a trickle. Ethan Graves had not cried in 200 years. He did not cry now. But he came close. Closer than the seal should have allowed, standing alone in his chambers at 3 in the morning, which was not morning underground, but felt like it. Felt like the exact hour when the world is thinnest, and the things you have been keeping out find their way in. He was reviewing trade reports. A column of numbers, import totals from the Eastern faction, grain, textiles, medical supplies, and somewhere between the 3rd and 4th line item, he felt it. A pressure behind his eyes, a fullness in his throat, a physiological cascade that his body remembered, even though his mind had been locked out of the experience for 2 centuries. He put the report down. He pressed his fingers to his eyes. He breathed. The pressure passed. The seal flexed and held, absorbing the emotional surge the way a shock absorber handles a pothole, with strain, with effort, but without failure. But it was closer now. The margin between holding and breaking was thinner than it had been a month ago, thinner than it had been a week ago, and the thinning was accelerating. Peter noticed. Peter noticed everything, which was his function and his burden, and he carried both with the silent efficiency of a man who had decided, centuries ago, that service was a form of love, and he would practice it until someone stopped him. The signs were subtle. The king's responses in council sessions were arriving half a second later than usual, not delayed by confusion or inattention, but by something that looked, if you had known this particular king for 300 years, like consideration, as if each decision was being run through a new filter, one that had not been active before, one that weighed something other than logic and precedent and structural necessity. The king had asked about the marriage petition, not a policy question, a personal one. He had asked Peter whether the couple was happy. Peter, who had processed the petition with his usual administrative precision and had not thought about the couple's emotional state even once, had been so startled by the question that he had answered honestly, "I do not know, Your Grace. I will inquire." "Do that," Ethan had said, and returned to his reports. Peter inquired. The couple was happy. Deliriously, embarrassingly, publicly happy, in the way that new couples are when the world has told them no for years, and then says yes. Peter relayed this information to the king with the same flat tone he used for trade figures and border disputes. Ethan nodded, and Peter saw, or thought he saw, or wanted to see, or feared he saw, the ghost of something cross the king's face. Not a smile. The memory of what a smile was supposed to feel like, passing through features that had forgotten how to make one. Peter added a note to the file in the second drawer. Meanwhile, Maggie Cole was conducting her own investigation. She did not go to the surface. She did not need to. Maggie had survived 150 years of vampire politics by understanding that information, like water, flows downhill. You did not need to climb to the source if you knew where to stand at the bottom. She positioned her people, discreet, trusted, old enough to be competent, and young enough to be ignored, at the surface exit points. They reported what they saw. The king, leaving twice a week, always Tuesday and Friday, always in civilian clothing, heading to the same neighborhood, entering a small building on a street that smelled, apparently, like coffee and motor oil. Maggie studied the reports. She studied the building. She studied the business license. Healing Hands Physiotherapy Clinic, registered to one Dr. William Adler, staffed by 3 therapists including one Lucy Harlow, age 24, blind from birth, no known affiliations, no significant digital presence, a woman so thoroughly unremarkable on paper that the paper was barely worth the ink. And yet, Maggie had lived long enough to know that the most dangerous people in any system were the ones who did not appear in the files, the ones who existed below the threshold of notice, the ones who were so small, so quiet, so deeply embedded in the ordinary machinery of life that they could reach places no army, no diplomat, no assassin could reach. Places like the inside of a sealed king. She did not tell Ethan she knew. She filed the information. She increased her monitoring of Simon Drake's faction, and she waited. Simon Drake was not waiting. In the eastern wing of the undercourt, in a chamber carved from black stone that absorbed light the way his mind absorbed opportunity, Simon Drake sat across a table from 3 faction leaders and laid out his case with the quiet precision of a man threading a needle. "The king is compromised," he said. The 3 leaders, each representing a territory, each commanding forces, each harboring ambitions they kept on leashes of varying length, listened. "Compromised how?" asked Eleanor Voss, who controlled the Northern Territory and had the face of a kind grandmother and the strategic mind of a chess engine. She was the oldest of the 3, and the most cautious, and therefore the most dangerous, because caution, in a centuries-old creature, meant patience, and patience meant she had been waiting for the right moment for longer than most of them had been alive. "He is visiting the surface," Simon said, "twice a week, without escort, without announcement, without strategic purpose." "Kings are permitted recreation," said the second leader, a younger man named Marcus Webb, who controlled a modest but strategically vital stretch of territory along the southern border, and who maintained his position through a combination of genuine competence and an absolute refusal to take sides until the outcome was certain. "Recreation does not produce trembling hands," Simon said. The room went quiet. "Explain," Eleanor said. Simon leaned forward. He had been preparing this moment for months, not the meeting itself, but the information, the narrative, the careful assembly of observations into a story that led to exactly one conclusion. "The king's emotional seal is degrading. I have 3 independent sources confirming behavioral anomalies, delayed responses in council, a marriage petition approval that contradicts 2 centuries of precedent, and a physical symptom that has not been observed since before the sealing." "What symptom?" His hand shakes. Left hand. Intermittent. Controllable, but present. The seal is leaking, and whatever is leaking through is beginning to affect his capacity to govern. Eleanor studied Simon the way she studied everything, with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had been reading people for 600 years, and was very, very tired of being underestimated. "You want the crown," she said, not an accusation, a statement of fact, delivered with the politeness of a woman handing someone their own knife. "I want stability. A king who feels is a king who hesitates. A king who hesitates is a liability. Our people did not survive 3 centuries of consolidation to be undermined by one man's inability to keep his grief contained. And if the seal holds, it will not hold. It is already failing. The process is irreversible. Within months, perhaps weeks, the king will be subject to the full emotional consequence of a 200-year suppression, and when that happens, he will be incapable of governance, incapable of defense, and incapable of protecting the court from those who would exploit the vacuum. Those being you," Marcus said, with the mild tone of a man making an observation about the weather. Simon smiled. His smiles were architectural, constructed, load-bearing, designed to support a specific impression. This one was designed to support the impression of a man who was not offended by the accusation, because the accusation was beneath him. "Those being anyone, I am offering a solution, the challenge of dominion." The room's temperature dropped. Not physically. The undercourt stone maintained a constant temperature regardless of season, but socially, emotionally, in the invisible thermal dynamics of power. The challenge of dominion was old law, older than any of them. It predated the consolidation, predated the court itself. It was a formal duel for the crown, ritualized, witnessed, final. The winner ruled. The loser did not survive, traditionally, though the law permitted exile as an alternative if both parties agreed. No challenge had been issued in 400 years. "You would stake your life on a duel with Ethan Graves," Eleanor said, and her voice carried the particular note of a woman who was impressed, despite her better judgment. "Ethan Graves, 2 centuries ago, would have destroyed me in minutes," Simon said. "Ethan Graves today is a man whose hand shakes when he signs documents. The seal is failing. His emotional infrastructure is collapsing, and when it collapses fully, when 200 years of grief hit him at once, he will be standing in that arena with a heart full of every feeling he has spent 2 centuries not having, and he will hesitate." He paused. "I will not." Eleanor looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at his hands. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "When?" Eleanor asked. "The next blood moon. 6 weeks. I will file the formal challenge at the end of this week. And if we decline to support you? Then you watch. That is all I ask. Watch, and when it is over, remember that I told you the truth before it happened, and extend to me the loyalty you would extend to any king who earned his crown through law rather than inheritance." Eleanor sipped her wine. Marcus studied the table. The third leader, a woman named Christine Reed, who had said nothing during the entire meeting, because Christine Reed never said anything during meetings, preferring to listen and decide later, in private, without the pressure of other people's expectations, stood and left without a word. Simon watched her go. Christine's silence was neither agreement nor refusal. It was the most honest response in the room. In a clinic that smelled like lavender and antiseptic, Lucy Harlow placed her hands on a man's back and felt the trickle become a stream. The seal was failing. She could feel it. The structural integrity of the locked space degrading session by session. The carefully maintained boundaries softening. The compressed emotional mass behind the wall expanding against its containment, like water freezing in a pipe. She had not told him. She did not know how to tell him. She did not have the vocabulary for what she was feeling. The technical language for a condition that existed in no medical textbook, no physiotherapy manual, no framework she had ever been trained in. She was making it up as she went. And she was terrified. Not of him, not of the thing behind the seal. Of the possibility that she was wrong, that her instinct to ease the pressure gradually, to create controlled releases, to manage the deconstruction of a 2-century emotional dam through patient, incremental work, was wrong. And the dam was going to break on its own timeline, not hers. And when it did, she would be standing next to it with her hands and her good intentions, and absolutely nothing that could stop a flood. "You're tighter today," she said, because she needed to say something, and the clinical observation was the safest thing she had. "I had a difficult week." "Difficult how?" He paused. She felt the pause in his muscles, a brief, total stillness that said he was deciding what to share, what to hold, what to let through the increasingly permeable filter between his sealed self and his spoken self. "I felt anger," he said, "twice. Once at a colleague, once at a situation I could not control. The anger was disproportionate to the cause, and I recognized its disproportionality even as I experienced it, and I could not stop it." "Could you identify what the anger was actually about?" "No." "Then it was not about the colleague or the situation. It was about whatever is behind the wall. The wall cracks, and the first thing that comes through is usually anger, because anger is the easiest emotion to feel. It has the clearest shape. It tells you what to do. Fight, push, break. The harder emotions, the ones without shapes, the ones that ask you to sit still and feel and do nothing, those come later." She worked in silence for a while. The seal vibrated under her attention. The grief layer pulsed its ancient rhythm. And beneath both, she felt something new. A third layer, deeper still, that she had not detected before. Not grief, not anger, something quieter. She pressed toward it, gently, the way she approached everything in this man's body, with patience and presence, and the understanding that she was navigating a landscape that had been unmapped for 2 centuries. The third layer responded to her touch. Love. That was what it was. Beneath the anger, beneath the grief, beneath 200 years of enforced emptiness, there was love, old love, the kind that does not die when its object dies, the kind that persists past death and past loss and past the decision to stop feeling, the kind that sits in the dark and waits with the impossible patience of something that knows it is permanent. Lucy felt it in her hands. It was warm. For the first time since she had started treating this man, something in his body was warm. Her throat tightened. Her eyes, which could not see, which had never seen, which were dark and quiet and used to the permanent privacy of blindness, filled with tears that she did not expect and could not explain and did not try to hide, because this man could see her face. But she was learning, session by session, that his ability to see was not the sense that mattered between them. Touch was what mattered, and her hands were touching love that had survived 200 years of solitary confinement, and it was warm, and it was alive, and it was the most extraordinary thing she had ever felt. "There is something else down here," she said, and her voice was thick, and she did not apologize for it. "What?" She shook her head. "I cannot tell you. Not because I do not want to. Because naming it will change it. Just know that it is there, and it is warm, and it is the reason. I am sure of this now. It is the reason the seal is failing. Not because of anything I am doing. Because what is in there wants to be felt again. It has been waiting, and it is patient, but it is done waiting." He was quiet for a long time. "You are crying," he said. "Yes. Why? Because what I am touching right now is the most beautiful thing I have ever felt in another person's body, and I have been touching people's bodies every day for 3 years, and nothing has come close. Not the fractures I found that saved surgeries, not the tensions I released that gave people their mobility back. This is something else." She removed her hands. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She straightened up and breathed, and found her professional footing again. The familiar architecture of healer and patient. The safe structure that kept her from falling into the depths of what she was discovering. "Same time Friday?" "Same time Friday." He left. Lucy stood in the treatment room, with her hands pressed together in front of her chest, palm to palm, and felt the warmth that still lived in her right hand, the warmth she had drawn from the deepest layer of a man who should not exist, whose body defied every framework she had, whose grief was older than her grandparents, and whose love was older still. She went home. She fed Decimal. She sat at her kitchen table. Her hands were warm. For the first time since the night market, they were warm. She dreamed that night, and for the first time in her life, she dreamed in images. Not the way sighted people dream. She had no reference for color, no template for faces, no stored visual data for her mind to replay. Instead, she dreamed in shapes and light, abstract, geometric, architectural. A vast underground space, columns of stone, a ceiling carved to look like a sky she had never seen, and at the center of it, a figure, dark, tall, still, standing beneath the false sky, with one hand pressed to his chest and a light coming through his fingers, green and faint and alive. She woke up. She lay in her bed with Decimal purring on her ankles, and her right hand pressed to her own chest, and the warmth still there, still present, still broadcasting its quiet signal across the distance between a blind woman in a walk-up apartment and a king in a kingdom beneath the earth. Connected. She did not know the word for what she was, for the gift she carried in her hands, for the lineage that had been lost 300 years ago and survived in her blood without her knowledge or permission. She did not know that people like her had once been named, had once been necessary, had once been hunted. She would learn. The formal challenge arrived on a Thursday. Peter Finch brought it to Ethan's study in a black envelope sealed with Simon Drake's sigil, a serpent consuming its own tail, which Maggie had once described as the most honest piece of personal branding in the kingdom because it told you exactly what Simon was, a thing that fed on itself, and called it strategy. Ethan opened the envelope. He read the single page inside. His face did not change. The muscles were still trained, the mask still held, but his left hand, resting on the desk, began to tremble. A challenge of dominion, Peter said, because the silence needed a frame. Yes. The last one was issued 432 years ago. It ended in 6 minutes. I am aware of the history. You cannot decline. I am aware of the law. Peter stood in front of the desk and looked at his king, his friend, though neither of them would have used that word, because their relationship had calcified into something beyond friendship, beyond loyalty, into the specific, wordless bond of two people who had been in the same room for 3 centuries and had run out of things to say, and discovered that the silence between them was its own language. Your Grace, your hand. Ethan looked down. His left hand trembled against the dark wood of the desk, with a fine, rapid vibration that he could feel but could not stop. He pressed it flat. The trembling continued beneath his palm, absorbed by the wood, but not eliminated, redirected, but not resolved. The blood moon is in 6 weeks, Peter said. Shall I begin preparations? Yes. Shall I inform Lady Cole? She already knows. Peter raised an eyebrow. It was the most expressive gesture he allowed himself in the king's presence, and it contained, in the slight upward motion of approximately 2 centimeters of facial hair and skin, the full force of his concern. Of course she does, Peter said, and left to begin preparations for the first challenge of Dominion in 400 years. Maggie arrived within the hour. She did not knock. She entered Ethan's study, the way weather enters a building, inevitably, without apology, and with the clear understanding that everything inside was about to get rearranged. Simon Drake, she said. Yes. 6 weeks. Yes. You cannot fight him. Ethan looked up from the challenge letter, which he had read 4 times, without absorbing a single additional piece of information beyond what the first reading had provided. I have fought considerably more dangerous opponents than Simon Drake. 200 years ago, you fought more dangerous opponents. 200 years ago, you were a different man. 200 years ago, you had a reason to win. The words landed in the room like stones dropped from a height. Maggie stood in front of his desk with her arms at her sides and her chin raised, and the particular fierce directness that had made her invaluable as a strategist and unbearable as a subordinate. I have reasons to win now, Ethan said. Name one. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the challenge letter. He looked at his trembling hand. He looked at Maggie Cole, who had watched him hollow himself out for 2 centuries and had said nothing and nothing and nothing, saving all of her words for this moment, for the one conversation that could not be delayed or deflected or absorbed into the machine of governance. The kingdom. The kingdom will survive any king. It survived before you. It will survive after. I am not asking about the kingdom. I am asking about you. Why do you want to win? I am the king. You are a man pretending to be a king. You have been pretending for 200 years, And you have been very good at it. And no one has noticed except me and Peter, and now, apparently, a blind woman in a clinic on Hester Street. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Ethan had ever heard. You know about Lucy. Of course I know about Lucy. I have known about Lucy for 3 weeks. I know her name, her address, her work schedule, and the fact that your sessions with her run 30 minutes past the appointment time, which means either she is providing an extraordinary amount of physiotherapy, or you are talking. And since you do not talk to anyone, not to Peter, not to me, not to the council, not to the empty room you sit in every night pretending that reading reports is the same as being alive, the fact that you are talking to a human woman you met 6 weeks ago is either the best thing that has happened to you in 2 centuries, or the worst. She paused. Which is it? Ethan stood. He walked to the window, the one that opened onto the stone wall of his chamber, the window that showed nothing, that existed because the architect had believed that even a king who lived underground deserved the architecture of possibility, and pressed his forehead against the cold stone. She found the seal, he said. Maggie was quiet for a long time. She found it, she said. The seal that you built yourself, that you have maintained for 2 centuries, that no healer or elder or practitioner in the court has ever detected. A human woman found it. With her hands, she reads bodies the way. I do not have a comparison. She placed her hands on my back and found the echo point within minutes. She found the grief layer within sessions. She found the seal itself on her 5th visit, and when she touched it, every piece of glass in the room cracked. Maggie sat down. She sat down the way people sit down when their legs have made a decision their mind has not yet endorsed. Glass. Every surface. Simultaneously. She did not see it. She heard it, called it thermal shock, and cleaned up. She does not know what you are. No. She does not know what the seal is. She knows what it does. She can feel its effects on my body. She describes it in clinical terms. Locked tension, structural holding patterns, emotional compression. She is working to release it, gradually, safely. And the glass? A side effect of the seal's response to external contact. It has been inert for 2 centuries. Her touch activated something, an energy discharge. Maggie pressed her fingers to her temples. She was 400 years old and had survived wars and plagues, and the particular, grinding exhaustion of being the smartest person in every room she entered, and none of those experiences had prepared her for this conversation. Ethan, the seal is failing. I know. Simon Drake knows. I suspected. He is counting on it. The challenge. He timed it deliberately. 6 weeks. He expects the seal to continue degrading. He expects you to enter the arena compromised. And he is right. If the seal fails during the duel, if 200 years of compressed grief hit you at once while you are fighting for your life, you will lose. You will not just lose the crown, you will lose yourself. Ethan pressed his forehead harder against the stone. The cold was not enough. Nothing was cold enough anymore, not the stone, not the air, not the careful, controlled temperature of a life lived without thermal fluctuation. Lucy's hands had brought warmth, and the warmth had spread, and the old cold was losing territory by the day. I have 2 options, he said. 3. 2. I can reseal, find an elder, rebuild the lock, close the door, restore myself to full function. Enter the arena, as I have been for 2 centuries, empty, precise, incapable of hesitation. And Lucy? The resealing would undo everything she has done. The leak would stop. The emotions would be recompressed. The process would reverse. And you would go back to being dead while alive. He did not answer that. What is the second option? I let the seal continue to fail. I allow the process Lucy has started to continue. I accept the emotions as they come, the anger, the grief, the rest of it, and I learn to carry them, all of them, in 6 weeks. That is not enough time. I know. You said 3 options, he reminded her. Maggie stood. She walked to the window and stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, the way they had stood 100 times before, at battlements, at borders, at the edge of decisions that would reshape their world. You go to her, Maggie said. Not as a patient, as yourself. You tell her the truth, all of it. What you are, what the seal is, what is coming. And you ask for her help. Not to release the seal slowly, to prepare you for its complete failure, to teach you how to stand inside the full force of what you have been not feeling, and not fall. She is human. She does not know what I am. She found a seal that no creature in this kingdom has ever detected. She touched it, and cracked every piece of glass in a room. She has been treating you for weeks, and your hand shakes now when it has not shaken in 2 centuries, and you approved a marriage petition, and listened to music, and missed the sky. She may be human, she is not ordinary. Ethan turned his head. He looked at Maggie, really looked, with the full weight of his attention, the kind of looking he had not directed at another person in 200 years. You are not telling me to stay away from her. I spent 200 years watching you stay away from everything. It kept you alive. It kept the kingdom stable. But it was never living. And I would rather help you survive what comes next than watch you survive another 200 years of nothing. She put her hand on his arm. It was the first time she had touched him voluntarily in decades, and the contact was brief and deliberate and meant exactly what it meant. I am here, and I have been here, and I am not going anywhere. Go to her, Ethan. Tell her, and then come back, and we will prepare for the blood moon together. She left. The door closed. Ethan stood at the window and felt the seal vibrate and the grief layer pulse and the deep, warm thing beneath both of them. The love, the old love, the love that Lucy had found and named as beautiful, glow in his chest, like a buried ember. 6 weeks. He went to her. Not to the clinic. The clinic was closed. It was 9 in the evening, and the receptionist had gone home, and Dr. Adler was at a conference, and the building was dark and locked. He went to her apartment. He had not asked Peter for the address. He did not need to. The signal, the connection that had formed between her hands and his seal, the thread that ran from her palm to his chest, pulled him north and east, up Hester Street, to a building above a laundromat, where the dryers hummed their eternal cycle, and the stairwell smelled like detergent and old carpet. He stood outside her door. He listened. Inside, a cat meowed, a kettle boiled. Footsteps crossed a wooden floor, sure, precise, the footsteps of a woman who knew every inch of her space by memory and muscle. He knocked. The footsteps stopped. He heard her approach the door. He heard the pause, the listening pause, the one she used instead of looking through a peephole, the one where she gathered information from sound the way other people gathered it from sight. "It's me," he said. A lock turned. A chain slid, the door opened, and Lucy Harlow stood in the doorway of her apartment, with a mug of tea in her hand and a cat weaving between her ankles, and an expression on her face that was not surprise. Not surprise, recognition. "I know," she said. "I felt you coming." He stepped inside. The apartment was small, a studio, a single room divided into zones by furniture rather than walls. Kitchen in the corner, bed against the wall, a table with 2 chairs, one of which had never been sat in, its seat occupied by a stack of books in Braille. The whole space was organized with the meticulous precision of a person, for whom disorder was not just inconvenient but dangerous. A misplaced chair was a collision, a dropped shoe was a fall, and the architecture of this room said, "I have built a world I can navigate, and it is small, and it is mine." Decimal the cat inspected him. The cat circled his legs once, sniffed his shoe, and apparently decided that whatever this man was, he was not a threat, and returned to the warm spot on the bed he had been occupying before the interruption. "Tea?" Lucy asked. "No, thank you. I came to tell you something." "Sit down." He sat. She sat across from him. She placed her mug on the table with the precise, practiced motion of someone who knew exactly where the table's edge was without touching it. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited. Ethan looked at her. He looked at her face, the closed eyes, the calm expression, the face of a woman who was listening with her whole body and was not afraid of what she was about to hear. "I am not what you think I am," he said. "I don't think you're anything. I feel what my hands tell me. What are you?" He told her. Not everything. Not the kingdom, not the politics, not Simon Drake and the challenge, and the blood moon. He told her the essential truth. The one that underpinned everything else. The one that would change the way she understood every session they had shared. He told her he was not human. He told her he had been alive for over 400 years. He told her the seal was not a metaphor or a clinical condition, but a deliberate, self-inflicted structure that he had built to survive the loss of someone he had loved for 50 years. He told her the loss had been physical, not just emotional, but cellular, a severing of a bond that had been woven into his body at a molecular level. He told her the seal had held for 200 years, and her hands had broken it in 9 seconds. He told her these things in a voice that did not tremble, because the seal still held enough to keep his voice steady, and Lucy sat across from him in her small, precise apartment, and listened with the same focused attention she gave to the bodies on her treatment table. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Say something," he said. "I am thinking." "About what?" "About the fact that everything you just told me explains everything my hands have been telling me for 6 weeks, and I am not as surprised as I should be, and I am trying to decide whether that means I already knew on some level, or whether it means I have spent so long trusting what my hands tell me, that my capacity for disbelief has been worn down to nothing." She picked up her tea. She took a sip. She put the tea down. "Your pulse is too slow," she said. "I noticed the first session. Your skin is too cold. Your muscles are too dense. The grief in your body is older than any grief I have ever encountered, and the love beneath it, the thing I found last week, the warm thing, is older still." I could not make sense of these things in a human framework. They did not fit. I filed them in the part of my brain where I keep things I can feel but cannot explain, and the file has been getting thicker every session. She paused. "I believe you. You believe me. I believe what my hands have been telling me. Your words just gave me a framework for the data. The data was already there. The data has been there since the night I put my hand on your face in a crowded market and felt a cold that had no business being inside a living body." Ethan looked at this woman, this small, blind, extraordinarily steady woman, sitting across from him with a cooling mug of tea and a cat on her bed and a stack of Braille books on her only spare chair, and felt something move behind the seal. Not anger, not grief, gratitude. A single, clean, uncomplicated drop of gratitude, falling through the crack in the wall and landing in his chest like a warm stone. She believed him, not because of evidence, not because of proof, because her hands had told her the truth before his mouth had, and she trusted her hands more than she trusted anything. "There is more," he said. "I figured. Someone has challenged me, a duel, in 6 weeks. If I lose, I lose. Everything. My position. Potentially my life. The challenger is counting on the seal's failure. He expects it to break during the fight. He expects 200 years of grief to hit me at once, and he expects it to destroy me. Will it? Yes. Almost certainly." Lucy was quiet again. The cat purred. The laundromat hummed. The city breathed its 10 million person breath outside the window. "You have 2 choices," she said. "Reseal, or face it. I have been told I have 3. What is the third? Come to you. Tell you the truth. Ask for your help. That is not a third choice. That is part of the second one." He almost smiled. The muscles moved. The ignition almost caught. "I cannot do this alone," he said, and the sentence cost him more than anything he had said in 200 years, because asking for help required admitting need, and admitting need required feeling the need, and feeling was the one thing the seal was designed to prevent. Lucy reached across the table. She found his hand, the left one, the trembling one, and held it. Her palm was warm, his was cold, and in the space between their temperatures, in the gap between her warmth and his cold, something moved, a current, a signal, a frequency that belonged to neither of them, individually, but existed only in the contact between them. "Then we do this together," she said. "Not slowly, not safely. You do not have time for slow and safe. We go straight through the middle. It could break me. It could, but you're already breaking. The seal is failing whether we help it or not. The question is not whether it comes down. The question is whether you're standing in a room full of people who know your name when it does, or whether you're alone." She squeezed his hand. "You are not alone." He looked at their hands, his cold, hers warm. held together in a small kitchen in a studio apartment above a laundromat on Hester Street, and felt, through the failing seal, through the cracks, through the 200-year dam that was losing its war against the river it had been holding back, the full, terrifying, extraordinary weight of what it meant to be touched by someone who was not afraid of what they found. "When do we start?" he asked. "We started 6 weeks ago," Lucy said. "You just didn't know it yet." 5 weeks before the blood moon, Lucy Harlow descended beneath the surface of the earth for the first time. Ethan had offered to describe the route. She had declined. "Just walk," she said. "I'll follow the sound of your footsteps. I've been following sounds my whole life. A few underground corridors are not going to change my process." They entered through a passage behind a building in the garment district, a door that looked like a service entrance, and opened onto a staircase that descended farther than any staircase in any building had a right to descend. Lucy counted the steps. 214. The air changed every 40 steps or so. Warmer, cooler, warmer again. Then a final drop into a deep, mineral cold that tasted like stone, and centuries, and the particular quiet of places that have never heard a car horn. "We're here," Ethan said. Lucy stood at the bottom of the staircase and listened. The space around her was enormous. She could feel it the way she felt the size of rooms, by the way sound traveled, by the echo, by the distance between her breath and its return from the nearest wall. This was not a room. This was a world. "It's big," she said, which was the understatement she had been saving for an occasion, exactly like this. "It is. Would you like me to describe it?" "Later. Right now I want to feel it." She stood still. She let the undercourt wash over her in its own language, the hum of the stone, the faint biological pulse of the phosphorescent moss. She could hear it, the barest whisper of organic process, the distant sound of movement, of voices, of a city going about its business beneath the feet of a city that did not know it existed. "It sounds like a heartbeat," she said. "The whole place, like standing inside a chest." Ethan looked at her. She stood at the entrance to his kingdom, in a jacket she had owned for 4 years, and sneakers she had bought on sale, and a cane she had used since she was 12. And she described the undercourt with more precision and more poetry than any of the architects who had built it. He brought her to his chambers. She sat in the chair across from his desk, the one Maggie usually occupied, and placed her hands on the armrests and felt the wood, the age, the weight of it. "This is where you work," she said. "This is where I sit. Work is what happens because the sitting would be unbearable otherwise. That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me. The seal is thinning. Honesty becomes easier when the machinery of suppression is failing." She smiled. It was a small smile, quick and private, the smile of someone who had just received a gift they did not expect and were not sure they deserved. They began. The work Lucy did in the clinic, the careful, layered approach, the gradual release, the patient negotiation with the sealed structure. That was not what happened in the undercourt. What happened in the undercourt was faster, deeper, more dangerous, and entirely unlike anything either of them had done before. Lucy placed her hands on his chest, directly over the seal. No preliminary work, no circling, no easing into it. She pressed her palms flat against the place beneath his collarbone, where the knot of compressed emotion lived, and she held there, and she breathed, and she waited. The seal responded immediately. The vibration she had felt in the clinic, the recognition, the "hello, you again," was stronger here, amplified by the stone, by the depth, by the proximity to whatever power lived in this underground world. The seal did not just recognize her touch. It responded to it. It leaned into it. The way a child leans into a hand on a fevered forehead, involuntary, instinctive, the body's own response to the presence of someone who knows what is wrong. "Talk to me," Lucy said, "while I work. Tell me about her." "About whom?" "The person you lost, the one the seal was built to survive." Ethan went very still. The seal tightened under her hands, a reflexive contraction, the kind that happens when you touch a wound and the body flinches. "I cannot." "You can. The seal is holding you back, and the seal is failing. If you try to talk about her now, the seal will resist, and the resistance will create friction, and the friction will generate heat, and the heat will soften the seal from the inside. It is the fastest way to accelerate what is already happening." You are asking me to deliberately weaken my own defenses. Yes. While a man who wants to kill me is counting the days until he can do it. Yes. He breathed. The breath hit the line and stopped. He pushed. The breath went past the line, 1 centimeter, 2, 3, and reached the seal, and the seal trembled under Lucy's hands. Her name was Grace, he said. The seal contracted, hard. Lucy felt it. A spasm of protective resistance, the last defense of a structure that had been built to prevent exactly this conversation from ever happening. The spasm moved through his ribs, through his chest, through the muscles of his shoulders, and his hands clenched, and his jaw tightened, and his body did everything it could to stop the name from being spoken. But it was too late. The name was out. Grace. 2 syllables that carried 50 years of love and 200 years of locked grief. Keep going, Lucy said. Her hands pressed harder. The seal vibrated against her palms like a living thing, like a trapped animal, like something that knew it was being opened, and was deciding, moment by moment, whether to fight or surrender. She was human. I cannot describe her the way I want to because the words I need are behind the seal. She read books in languages she was still learning. She mouthed the words. I would watch her from across the room and feel, I do not know. I do not have access to what I felt. I only know that the room she was in was the room I wanted to be in, and the floor she sat on was the floor I wanted to sit on, and the world she existed in was the only world I was interested in occupying. His voice had changed. It was not the controlled, diplomatic voice he used in council sessions. It was thinner, rougher, stripped of its professional finish. The voice of a man speaking through a closing throat about something that had been locked in silence for 200 years. Lucy felt the seal shift. Not crack, shift. Like a tectonic plate moving a fraction of an inch, releasing pressure that had been building for centuries. The shift was small. Its implications were enormous. She died, Ethan said. She was killed. By people who wanted. It does not matter what they wanted. She died, and the bond severed. And the severing was, it was not grief. Grief is what humans feel. This was structural, cellular. The bond had been woven into my body at a level deeper than muscle, deeper than bone. And when it broke everything. Every nerve, every pathway, every circuit that connected me to the experience of being alive. It was like having my nervous system torn out while I was still conscious. His breathing had changed. The invisible line was gone. His breath moved freely through his chest for the first time, passing through the space where the line had been, without resistance, reaching the seal and moving past it, into the compressed space behind, and the seal trembled under this intrusion, not failing, not breaking, but acknowledging. Lucy felt the tears on his face before he did. She felt them in the vibration of his jaw, in the contraction of the muscles around his eyes, in the way his breathing hitched and caught and reformed into a pattern that was not controlled breathing or free breathing but something in between. The breathing of a person learning to cry after 200 years of not crying. Do not stop, she said. I sealed myself within a week. I could not survive it. Not the grief, the absence, the bond space. The place where she had been inside me was empty. And the emptiness was not empty the way a room is empty. It was empty, the way a wound is empty. It screamed. Every second of every day, it screamed. And the seal was the only way to make it stop. A tear fell. Lucy felt it hit her wrist. Warm, wet. The first tear Ethan Graves had shed in 203 years. It landed on her skin, and she felt, in that single drop, the concentrated essence of 2 centuries of loss. Dense, impossibly heavy. A tear that weighed more than a normal tear, because it carried 200 years of unfallen tears behind it. The seal cracked. Not a hairline crack this time. A real crack. A structural fracture that ran from the center of the sealed space to its outer edge, like a fault line in bedrock, and Lucy felt it happen under her palms, the sudden give, the release of pressure, the sound that was not a sound but a sensation, the feeling of a dam developing its first serious fault. Ethan made a noise. Not the gasp from the clinic, a different noise, lower, older, a sound that had been sitting in his chest for 2 centuries waiting for a crack wide enough to escape through. The stone walls of his chamber vibrated. The moss flickered. The iron door hummed in its frame. Lucy held on. Her hands on the seal, her weight forward, her body braced against the force of what was coming through. Because something was coming through. Not all of it, not the full flood, but a surge, a wave, a quantity of compressed emotion that moved through the crack and hit her palms and traveled up her arms and into her chest, and she felt it. She felt his grief. Not as data, not as clinical observation, as experience, as if the grief had traveled through the seal, through her hands, through her arms, and into her own chest, and she was feeling what he had been not feeling for 200 years. The loss, the absence, the bond space screaming, the specific, particular horror of reaching for someone who was supposed to be part of your body and finding nothing, again and again and again, every moment of every day for 200 years, reaching and finding nothing, until the reaching itself became the wound, and the only way to survive was to stop reaching altogether. Lucy's knees buckled. She caught herself on the edge of his desk, one hand still on his chest, the other gripping wood, and she breathed through the wave the way she had been telling him to breathe, not fighting it, not naming it, just letting it move through her, like sound through a tuning fork. The wave passed, the surge ebbed, the crack in the seal remained, open, raw, aching, but the pressure behind it had decreased, not by much, by enough. Ethan sat in his chair with tears on his face, and his hand over Lucy's hand on his chest, and breathed, freely, fully, the deepest breath he had taken since the night Grace died. "How do you feel?" Lucy asked. Her voice was rough, her own eyes were wet, her hand still burned where it pressed against the cracked seal, and the grief she had absorbed still echoed in her chest, diminishing, but not gone, a secondary heartbeat that was not hers. "I feel," he said. "That is, I feel. Not a specific thing, the capacity, the machinery. It is, turning on, like a building where someone has been walking through the floors, switching on lights that have been off for years, and each one illuminates a room I had forgotten existed. Does it hurt? Yes. Good. Pain means the nerves are alive. If you could not feel the pain, I would be worried." She removed her hand from his chest. She stepped back. She leaned against his desk and let her legs shake, and let her body process the secondary grief that was still moving through her system like aftershocks. "We do this every day," she said. "Every day for 5 weeks. Each session, we open the crack a little wider. We let more through. We let your body relearn what it means to feel, not all at once, not in a flood, but in manageable waves. By the time the duel arrives, the seal will be gone. The grief will have moved through you, and you will be standing in that arena as a man who feels everything, and that will not be a weakness. How can feeling everything not be a weakness? Because a man who feels nothing has no reason to win, and a man who feels everything has every reason." Ethan looked at her, this blind woman leaning against his desk in the heart of a kingdom she had not known existed 12 hours ago, with grief in her chest that was not hers, and a plan that was either brilliant or catastrophic, and no way to tell which until it was too late. "Every day," he said. "Every day." They began the next morning. Lucy descended through the passage on Ethan's arm, counting the stairs, memorizing the route. By the 3rd day, she did not need his arm. By the 5th, she navigated the corridor to his chambers alone, her cane tapping the stone floor, her free hand trailing the wall, reading the undercourt's architecture the way she read everything, through touch, through sound, through the extraordinary instrument of her attention. Peter Finch watched her arrive each morning with the expression of a man who had seen many unusual things in 400 years, and was adding one more to the list. "She is remarkable," he said to Maggie, standing in the corridor outside the king's chambers, while the session took place behind the iron door. "She is dangerous," Maggie said. "Dangerous how?" "Dangerous because she is the first thing in 200 years that has made him care whether he lives or dies, and caring whether you live or die is a liability when someone is trying to kill you. Or a motivation. Motivation is a liability. Motivation means there is something to lose. The most dangerous fighters are the ones who have nothing to lose. The most dangerous fighters," Peter said, with the quiet firmness of a man who had served long enough to earn the right to disagree, are the ones who have everything to lose and refuse to lose it. Maggie looked at him. He looked back. The corridor held its breath. "I hope you are right," she said. "Because if you are wrong, we lose a king." The sessions were brutal. Lucy pressed against the seal every day, opening the crack wider, wider, letting the compressed emotions escape in waves that shook the stone walls and flickered the moss, and sent tremors through the undercourt that the court felt but could not explain. The first week, anger came through. Raw, undirected, 200 years of unfelt fury, at loss, at circumstance, at the universe's casual cruelty, in taking the one thing that had made an immortal life worth the effort of being immortal. Ethan raged, not at Lucy, never at Lucy, but at the walls, at the stone, at the air itself. He broke a desk. He dented the iron door. He stood in the center of his chamber, with his fists at his sides, and his chest heaving, and his eyes blazing with an anger so old it had its own geological strata. Lucy sat in the corner and waited. She did not leave. She did not flinch. She sat with her hands in her lap and her head tilted, listening, always listening. And when the anger exhausted itself, she stood and walked to him and placed her hand on his chest and said, "That is one layer. There are more." The second week, grief came through. Not the sharp, dramatic grief of fresh loss, but the long, slow, erosional grief of 200 years. The grief of an anniversary passed alone, then another, then another, then 200 of them, each one a small stone added to a pile that had grown so large it blocked the sun. Ethan did not rage. He went quiet. He sat in his chair for hours without speaking, without moving, with tears running down his face in a continuous, silent stream that seemed to have no beginning and no end. Lucy sat beside him. She held his hand. She did not say it will be okay, or it gets better, or any of the things people say when they are trying to put a bandage on a wound that is too large for bandages. She held his hand, and she was present, and she let the grief move through him at its own pace. Peter brought tea. He brought it without being asked, because after 3 centuries of service, he knew when a room needed tea, and this room needed tea the way a desert needs rain. The third week, something changed. The grief subsided, the anger settled, and beneath both of them, rising from the deepest layer of the seal, the layer Lucy had found weeks ago, and named as warm, the love emerged. It came through not as a wave, but as a glow, a spreading warmth that started in his chest and moved outward through his ribs, his shoulders, his arms, his hands. The trembling stopped, not because the seal was holding, but because the seal was gone, dissolved, eroded, dismantled by 3 weeks of daily sessions, by Lucy's hands, and her patience, and her absolute refusal to look away from what she found. Ethan sat in his chamber with the seal gone, and felt everything. Not sequentially, not in order, not anger, then grief, then love, all of it, simultaneously. The full spectrum of 200 years of unfelt human experience, landing in his consciousness at once, like a symphony, played at full volume after 2 centuries of silence. He gasped. His eyes went black. The moss flared green. The stone walls hummed, and Lucy held his hand and breathed beside him, and anchored him to the present moment, the way a lighthouse anchors ships to the concept of shore, not by stopping the storm, but by being visible through it. "I have you," she said. The storm raged. The emotions crashed through him, wave after wave, year after year, the specific, detailed, individual grief of every moment he had not felt for 200 years, arriving in his body with the precision of mail that had been held at the post office since 1823 and was now being delivered all at once. Grace reading on the floor. Grace laughing at his jokes, which were never good, but were always sincere. Grace dying, the bond severing, the scream he never screamed, the funeral he never held, the 200 years of mornings waking up and reaching for someone who was not there. All of it, every moment, delivered with interest. Ethan Graves sat in the chair in his chamber with a blind woman holding his hand and a cat purring on his desk. Decimal had followed Lucy down one morning and refused to go back up, and felt 200 years of human experience pour through the space where the seal had been. It did not destroy him. It hurt. It hurt more than the severing, more than the sealing, more than any of the wars or wounds or losses of 4 centuries of life. It hurt because feeling was painful, and he had forgotten. The way you forget how loud the world is, until you take out the earplugs. But it did not destroy him. Because Lucy was there. Because her hand was warm. Because her presence in the room was a frequency that his body had learned to tune to over 6 weeks of sessions, and that frequency said, "You are not alone, and you are not dying, and this is what it feels like to be alive, and it is terrible, and it is beautiful, and I am not letting go." He did not know how long it lasted. Hours. Maybe longer. The undercourt existed outside of solar time, and the chamber had no clock, because Ethan had broken the last one during the anger week, and Peter had not replaced it, out of either pragmatism or symbolism. When it was over, not finished, because he understood now that it would never be finished, that feeling was not a task that ended but a state that continued. He sat in the chair with his eyes closed, and his hand in Lucy's hand, and breathed. Freely, fully. Past the line that no longer existed, through the space where the seal had been, down into the bottom of his lungs where air had not reached in 200 years. "There," Lucy said. "All the way down." He opened his eyes. The room was the same. The desk, the wall, the window that showed nothing. Decimal on the corner of the desk, one paw hanging off the edge, watching, with the supreme indifference of a creature whose entire emotional range had always been available, and who therefore could not comprehend what the fuss was about. "The duel is in 2 weeks, Ethan said. "I know. I can feel everything. I know. Is that enough?" Lucy stood. She placed both hands on his face. The same gesture that had started everything. Her palms on his jaw. Her fingers reading the landscape of his features. And felt. No cold. No sealed door. No grief-frozen architecture. Just a face. A living face, full of everything a face is supposed to be full of. Pain and warmth and fear and determination. And the specific, hard-won expression of a person who has been broken open and has decided to stay open because the alternative is 200 more years of nothing. "It is enough," she said. Peter Finch had been investigating Lucy Harlow for 4 weeks. He had started with the obvious channels, public records, employment history, the thin file of a woman who moved through the world with minimal bureaucratic wake. Birth certificate, foster care records, a disability registration that had been filed when she was 6 and renewed every 5 years, with the impersonal efficiency of a system that categorized people by their deficits rather than their capacities. The file told him nothing useful. Lucy Harlow was, by every documented measure, exactly what she appeared to be. A blind physiotherapist with good hands, and no family, and a cat named after a mathematical concept. Then Peter dug deeper. He did not dig with human tools. He dug with the archives of the undercourt, records that predated the city above, records carved into stone and preserved in chambers that maintained a constant temperature and humidity, because the information they held was too old and too important to trust to paper. He started with her surname. Harlow, common enough, no flags. He traced it back 3 generations. Her mother, who had abandoned her at birth. Her mother's mother, who had died young. Her mother's mother's mother, who had emigrated from somewhere in the north of England in the early 20th century. A thin line of women who left few traces and no explanations. He traced the English line, further back, past immigration records and into parish registers and baptismal fonts, and the kinds of records that survived because churches were better at preservation than governments. The line thinned as it went back. Fewer records, more gaps, until it disappeared entirely, somewhere in the mid-17th century, which was not unusual for a family of modest means and no particular historical significance. Except that the disappearance was not gradual. It was abrupt. 1 generation, the family existed in the records, births, marriages, deaths, the ordinary paper trail of ordinary people. The next generation, nothing, complete absence. As if someone had taken scissors to the historical fabric and cut the family out. Peter knew what that kind of disappearance meant. He had seen it before, in the archives, in the records of a different kind of history, the hidden history, the vampire history, the record of events that the surface world did not know had happened. He went to the restricted section of the archives, the section that required blood identification to enter, the section that held the records of things the court did not discuss, and did not teach, and did not remember, because remembering was dangerous, and forgetting was policy. He found the file in a cabinet that had not been opened in 200 years. The label was faded but legible, written in a hand that predated typewriters and computers, and every mechanical advancement that humans had made in the centuries since. The label read, "Vain Readers." Peter sat at the archive table, with the file open in front of him, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the cold weight of historical convergence settling onto his shoulders. Vain Readers. The name was almost quaint, a folksy term for something that had terrified the vampire world for centuries. Humans born with the ability to read vampire bond magic through touch. They could feel what vampires felt. They could detect seals, bonds, and emotional architectures that were invisible to every other species on Earth. They could reach into the locked spaces of a vampire's body and find the things that had been hidden there: grief, love, rage, the full spectrum of emotional experience that vampires, with their centuries of life and their capacity for bonds deeper than anything human, generated in quantities that could level buildings. Vain Readers had been rare, one in a generation, maybe two. They appeared in certain bloodlines, human bloodlines, families with no knowledge of the vampire world, no connection to the underground courts, no understanding of the gift that moved through their genes like a recessive trait, waiting for the right combination of alleles to express itself. They had been useful, once. Centuries ago, before the consolidation, before the courts unified, Vain Readers had served as mediators, healers, diagnosticians. They could feel what vampires could not or would not articulate. They could detect emotional blockages, bond damage, the specific psychological injuries that accumulated over centuries of immortal life. They were, in a sense, the therapists of the vampire world, the only beings capable of reaching into the sealed hearts of creatures who lived too long to remain open. Then someone decided they were dangerous. Peter read the file. The language was old, formal, the language of bureaucratic erasure, the kind of writing that turns an atrocity into a policy decision and a genocide into a series of administrative actions. The Vain Reader Eradication Protocol, initiated 312 years ago, sponsored by, Peter turned the page, a coalition of faction leaders who argued that Vain Readers represented a security threat. They could detect seals. They could feel hidden emotions. They could access the internal states of kings and generals and strategists, and that access was a weapon, and weapons in the wrong hands were unacceptable. The protocol was efficient. Within a decade, every known Vain Reader bloodline had been identified and terminated. The records were sealed, the history was buried, and the vampire world moved on, as it always moved on, with the quiet consensus that the thing they had done was necessary, and the silence around it was appropriate. Peter read the list of terminated bloodlines. 17 families, each one traced, confirmed, and ended. The records included dates, locations, and the names of the operatives who had carried out the terminations. He stopped at the 14th family. The name was not Harlow. The name had been different, 300 years ago. The family had changed it, somewhere in the intervening centuries, the way immigrant families change names, through necessity or bureaucracy, or the simple desire to disappear into a new country and a new life. But the location was right. Northern England. The same parish, the same period. And the record noted, in a footnote that was almost an afterthought, that one member of the 14th family had survived, a child, an infant, overlooked in the termination, because she had been left with a neighboring family, and her connection to the bloodline had not been documented. An infant who grew up and married and had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, each one carrying the gene, each one unaware of what they carried, until the gene expressed itself in a woman born blind on a Tuesday in a hospital on the east side of a city that sat on top of a vampire kingdom. Lucy Harlow. The last Vain Reader. Peter closed the file. He sat in the restricted section of the archives with the cold stone walls around him and the faded records in front of him, and thought very carefully about what he had found and what it meant. It meant Lucy was not an accident. Her ability to find Ethan's seal, to read his grief, to reach into the locked architecture of his emotional system. That was not intuition, not clinical skill, not the fortunate sensitivity of a gifted healer. It was hereditary. It was specific. It was the last expression of a gift that had been systematically eradicated 3 centuries ago by people who feared what it could do. And it meant something else. Peter turned back to the file. He found the page that listed the sponsors of the eradication protocol, the faction leaders who had argued for the termination of the Vane Reader bloodlines. The list was short. 5 names. Peter knew 3 of them. Historical figures, long dead, their legacies absorbed into the architecture of the modern court. The 4th name was crossed out, redacted. Peter could not read it. The 5th name was Simon Drake. Peter's blood went cold, which was impressive, given that his blood had been cold for 400 years. Simon Drake had sponsored the eradication protocol. Simon Drake had argued for the termination of the Vane Readers. Simon Drake had helped eliminate the only humans capable of reaching into a vampire's sealed heart and finding what was hidden there. And now Simon Drake was challenging a king whose seal had been broken by the last surviving member of a bloodline he had tried to destroy. Peter stood. He replaced the file. He locked the cabinet. He walked out of the restricted section and through the archive corridor and up the stairs to the main level of the undercourt. And he moved faster than he had moved in decades, because the information he carried was not academic. It was tactical. It was the kind of information that changes the shape of a conflict. He found Maggie first, because Maggie would know what to do with the information, and Peter was a steward, not a strategist, and the difference between the two was the difference between a man who carries a weapon and a man who knows where to point it. Maggie listened. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without interruption, with the focused intensity of a predator tracking movement in tall grass. When Peter finished, she said one word: "Where?" The restricted archives. The file is original. The records are verified. The connection is documented. Lucy Harlow is a direct descendant of the 14th bloodline. The Vane Reader gene survived the protocol through a single overlooked infant. It has been dormant, or undetected, for 3 centuries, until now. And Simon, 5th sponsor of the eradication protocol. He was instrumental in identifying the bloodlines and arguing for their termination. Maggie stood at her window. The grand gallery stretched below, empty and polished, and indifferent to the revelations being whispered in the chambers above it. "He killed them to prevent exactly this," she said. "A Vane Reader, reaching a sealed king. A Vane Reader, finding the thing that no one else could find. A Vane Reader, undoing the emotional architecture that keeps a king predictable and governable and safe. Yes. And now the last one has done exactly that. Yes." Maggie turned from the window. Her face had the expression Peter had seen only a handful of times in a century and a half of service. The expression of a woman who had just recalculated the odds of a fight and found that they were both worse and better than she had thought. Worse, because Simon Drake's motivations were deeper and older than anyone had realized. He was not just challenging a weakened king. He was finishing a project he had started 300 years ago. The elimination of anyone and anything that could reach into the sealed hearts of his kind and find the truth. Better, because Lucy Harlow was not just a gifted healer with good hands. She was the last carrier of a gift that had been engineered by evolution, or providence, or whatever force governed the slow, patient genetics of impossible things. And that gift had reached Ethan Graves, against odds that should have been 0, and the fact that it had reached him at all meant that the universe, or something like it, was pushing back against 3 centuries of enforced silence. "Does Ethan know?" Maggie asked. "No." "Does Lucy?" "No." "Tell them both. Today. Before the blood moon. They need to know what they are. Both of them." Peter left. He walked through the corridors of the undercourt, with the restricted knowledge living in his chest like a second heart, beating its own rhythm, telling its own story. A story about a girl and a king, and a gift that should have been destroyed and was not. And a man named Simon Drake, who had spent 3 centuries believing he had won, and was about to discover that he had not. Peter found them together, in Ethan's chambers. Lucy was sitting cross-legged on the floor. She preferred the floor for sessions now. said the stone grounded her, conducted the vibrations better. And Ethan sat across from her with his hands in hers, and his eyes closed, and his face doing something it had not done in 200 years. Expressing not a single emotion, a weather system of emotions, crossing his features like clouds across a sky, sadness, relief, something that might have been humor, something that was definitely fear, all of it moving, all of it alive, all of it present. Peter knocked. He had never knocked before. The king's door was always open to his steward. But something about the scene inside the chamber required the small courtesy of announcement. "Come in," Ethan said. Peter entered. He looked at the king and the woman on the floor. He looked at their hands, linked. He looked at the space between them, which was not empty but full of whatever moved through the contact of a vein reader's palms and a king's unsealed heart. "Your Grace, I have found something. About Lucy." Lucy turned her head toward him. Her eyes, dark, unfocused, pointed in his general direction, but not at him, because she pointed her ears at people rather than her eyes, were calm. "About me?" she said. Peter told them everything. The bloodline, the gene, the vein readers, the eradication protocol, the 14th family, the overlooked infant, the 3 centuries of dormancy, the impossible survival of a gift that should have been destroyed and was not. He told them about Simon Drake. The room was very quiet when he finished. Decimal, who had been sleeping on the desk, raised his head and looked at the 3 people with the expression of a cat who sensed emotional gravity and wanted no part of it. Lucy spoke first. "So this is not just good hands." "No," Peter said. "This is a hereditary ability, a specific, documented, systematically targeted ability. You are the last carrier of a gift that your ancestors did not know they had, that was destroyed, to prevent exactly what you are doing right now. And Simon Drake, the man who challenged Ethan, he helped destroy my people. Your ancestors, yes." Lucy was quiet. Her hands, still linked with Ethan's, tightened, not a grip of fear, a grip of recognition. The kind that happens when a person discovers that the thing they have always been, the strange one, the impossible one, the one whose hands do things no one can explain, has a name, has a history, has a lineage that connects them to something larger than a studio apartment above a laundromat. Ethan spoke. His voice was steady, not the old steadiness, the mechanical, sealed steadiness, a new steadiness, the steadiness of a man who has been broken open and has found his footing in the wreckage. The same people who killed Grace, killed the vein readers. The 2 events are connected. Peter nodded. The eradication protocol was initiated in the same decade. The faction that sponsored the protocol was allied with the faction that targeted Grace's bond line. The strategic logic was consistent. Eliminate bonded humans. Eliminate vein readers. Remove the emotional vulnerability. Remove the ability to detect the removal. Maggie appeared in the doorway. She had been listening from the corridor, a habit she had never bothered to hide. "Simon did not just want the crown," she said. "He wanted a specific kind of king. A sealed king. A king without emotions, without bonds, without the capacity to feel. Because a king who feels is a king who makes unpredictable decisions, and unpredictable decisions are the enemy of anyone who has spent 3 centuries positioning themselves to seize power." She looked at Ethan. "He killed Grace to break you. He killed the vein readers so no one could fix you. And he waited 200 years for the seal to either hold forever or fail catastrophically. He was prepared for both outcomes. What he was not prepared for was a blind woman in a night market who happened to be the one thing he thought he had destroyed." The room held its breath. Lucy released Ethan's hands. She stood. She was small, shorter than everyone in the room, lighter, human, blind, armed with nothing but a pair of hands, and a gift she had not known she had until 10 minutes ago. "How long until the blood moon?" she asked. 11 days, Peter said. Lucy nodded. She reached up and touched Ethan's face, the gesture that had started everything, her palm on his jaw, her fingers reading the landscape of his features. She felt the difference. No cold, no sealed door, no compressed grief. Just a face full of feeling, and beneath the feeling, the strength that came from having survived the worst thing a person could survive, and choosing to remain open anyway. "Then we have 11 days, she said. and we are not wasting a single one. The 11 days passed like a held breath. Ethan trained. Not the way he had trained for 2 centuries, mechanical, precise. His body executing movements while his mind existed somewhere behind the seal, disconnected from the physical experience of combat. This training was different. This training was alive. Maggie ran the sessions. She was the finest combat strategist in the undercourt, possibly the finest combat strategist in any court, a distinction she neither claimed nor denied, because self-assessment was a waste of time she could spend making other people better at staying alive. She put him through drills that would have been routine 2 centuries ago, and were now, with the seal gone and his emotional capacity restored, something entirely different. Every strike carried feeling. Every block carried intention. Every movement connected to a body that was no longer an instrument but an experience. A body that felt exhaustion as more than data, felt impact as more than force calculation, felt the particular rush of combat not as a strategic exercise, but as what it actually was, a conversation between 2 beings about who was going to walk away. "You are hesitating," Maggie said on the 3rd day, after Ethan pulled a strike that would have landed clean. I felt his pain. His pain is irrelevant, your survival is not. I cannot hit someone and not feel it. Then feel it, and hit them anyway. That is the difference between a fighter who feels nothing and a fighter who feels everything. One is a machine, the other is a choice. Machines are predictable, choices are not. She came at him again, faster, harder. And Ethan met her, not with the empty mechanical precision of the sealed king, but with something rawer, something that had teeth, and grief, and 200 years of anger at the man who had taken Grace and killed Lucy's ancestors and engineered the very lock that had kept Ethan in the dark for centuries. The anger was useful. Maggie showed him how to use it, not as fuel, which burned fast and left nothing, but as architecture, as a framework that held his other emotions in place during combat, the way a skeleton holds organs. The anger held the grief held the love held the determination. And all of it, layered and integrated, produced a fighter who was not the machine he had been, and was not the broken man Simon expected him to be, but something else entirely. A man who fought with his whole self, every emotion, every memory, every drop of the 200 years of experience that had been locked away and was now, finally, available. Better, Maggie said on the 7th day, bleeding from a cut on her arm that would heal in minutes, but that she wore with the particular pride of a teacher whose student had finally surpassed her. You let me land that. I absolutely did not let you land that. You are faster than you were 200 years ago. The seal compressed your emotional energy. Now that it's released, the energy is available for physical use. You are moving at a speed I have not seen since before the consolidation. I did not know that was possible. Neither did I. Apparently, the seal was not just containing your emotions, it was containing your full capacity. You have been operating at reduced output for 2 centuries, and you did not know it, because you had no frame of reference for what full output felt like. Ethan stood in the training chamber, a vast, stone-floored arena deep in the undercourt, lit by phosphorescent moss that pulsed in time with the heartbeats of the combatants, and felt his body humming with a power he had not known he possessed. Not just speed, strength, reflexes, perception. The seal had not simply locked away his emotions, it had locked away a percentage of everything, every capacity, every sense, every channel of energy that connected his mind to his body. And now, with the lock removed, the full current flowed, and the current was enormous. Can I beat him? Ethan asked. You could beat anything on this planet right now, Maggie said. The question is not whether you can beat Simon Drake. The question is whether you can feel the pain of the fight. The real pain, not the data, and keep fighting. Because Simon will try to break you emotionally, not physically. He will target the unsealed space. He will use words as weapons. He will say things designed to send you back to the night Grace died, and if he succeeds, if he triggers a grief cascade in the middle of the duel, your body's full capacity will not matter, because your mind will not be here to direct it. What do? You let him say what he says, you feel what you feel, and you keep moving. That is the whole strategy. Feel and move. Feel and move. Do not stop either one. Lucy arrived on the 8th day. She had been making the descent daily, down the 214 steps. Through the corridors she now navigated without hesitation, past the guards who had learned to step aside for the blind human woman, who walked through their kingdom with a white cane and an air of absolute certainty. She came to the training chamber. She sat on a stone bench at the edge of the arena and listened to Ethan spar with Maggie, her head tilted, her hands resting on her knees. She could not see the combat. She could hear it, the footwork, the impact, the breathing, the particular sound a body makes when it moves at full capacity, with full intention. And she could feel it, the emotional output of a man fighting with his whole self, the waves of anger and determination, and fear, and joy, that radiated from the arena floor, like heat from asphalt. "He's good," she said to Peter, who had positioned himself beside her with a cup of tea, and the expression of a man who was attending a performance he was not entirely sure he understood. "He is better than good. He is what he was before the seal, but with 2 centuries of governance experience layered on top. He was always the finest fighter of his generation. The seal suppressed it. Now it is back, and it has compound interest." Lucy smiled. Compound interest on combat ability. That is a very Peter Finch way to describe it. "I am a man of specifics. I know. It is one of your better qualities." They sat together on the bench and watched, or, in Lucy's case, listened to, the king of the undercourt prepare for the fight of his life, with the focus and fury of a man who had discovered, after 200 years of emptiness, that he had something worth fighting for. The night before the blood moon, Ethan came to Lucy's apartment. He climbed the stairs. He knocked. She opened the door. He stepped inside and stood in her small, precise kitchen and looked at the woman, who had changed everything, by putting her hand on his face in a crowd. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Yes." "Good. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true. Fear means you care about the outcome. 2 months ago, you would not have been afraid. You would have walked into that arena with the same mechanical precision you applied to everything, and you would have either won or lost, and the result would have registered as data and nothing more. Tonight you are afraid, because you want to live, and wanting to live is the whole point." He sat at her table. She made tea. Decimal climbed into his lap, which the cat had been doing with increasing frequency, apparently having decided that whatever this large, cold-skinned visitor was, he was an acceptable source of warmth and chin scratches. "Simon killed Grace," Ethan said. "Or ordered it, or enabled it. Peter's research connects him to the faction that targeted our bond. He did it to break me, and then he killed your people to make sure no one could put me back together. Yes. You are remarkably calm about this." "I am not calm. I am focused. There is a difference. Calm means the storm is not here. Focused means the storm is here, and I have decided where to look." She sat across from him. She reached across the table and found his hands and held them. His hands were warm. Not human warm. His temperature was still lower than hers, but warmer than they had been. Warmer than the first night she had touched his face. Warmer than any of the sessions in the clinic, when her hands had found only cold and compression, and the deep earth chill of a man who had turned off his own furnace. "Listen to me," she said. "Tomorrow, you are going to walk into an arena and fight a man who has spent 3 centuries trying to destroy what you are. He killed your love. He killed my ancestors. He engineered the lock that kept you in the dark for 200 years. And tomorrow, he is going to look at you and expect to see a broken king. A man whose seal has failed, whose emotions are uncontrolled, whose capacity to fight has been compromised by the very things that make him alive." She squeezed his hands. "He is going to be wrong. He is going to be wrong because the thing he tried to destroy is the thing that will beat him. Not your speed, not your strength, not your strategy, your ability to feel, your ability to stand in the middle of everything you have been not feeling for 200 years and keep moving. He cannot do that. He has never felt what you are feeling right now, because he has never loved anything enough to lose it, and he has never lost anything deeply enough to build a wall against it, and he has never had someone help him break the wall down. He is a man who has lived 4 centuries without ever being broken open, and he thinks that makes him strong. It makes him brittle." She released his hands. She leaned back. Decimal purred in his lap, vibrating against his thighs with the simple, uncomplicated contentment of a creature whose emotional range had always been available, and who used it primarily for sleeping and eating and demanding attention at inconvenient times. "Tomorrow," Lucy said, "you fight, and I will be there." "In the arena?" "Somewhere. I have not figured out the logistics yet, but I will be there. I will be close enough to feel you, and you will be close enough to feel me, and that connection, the thing that has been running between us since the night market, that is not going away because a man with a crown complex decided to pick a fight." Ethan looked at her. This woman, this blind, fierce, impossible woman, who had found the lock he built, and the grief he hid, and the love he buried, who had held his hand, while 200 years of compressed emotion poured through him, who had sat in a corner, while he raged, and sat beside him while he wept, and stood her ground, while every piece of glass in a room shattered, because her hands had touched the truth of him. He wanted to say something large enough to match what she had given him, what she had made possible, what she had restored. But the words were new. All his words were new, minted fresh from a vocabulary that had been locked behind the seal for 2 centuries, and the ones he found were small and simple, and insufficient, and exactly right. "The burrito was cold, thank you," he said. Lucy smiled. It was the smile she wore when her hands found a fracture no one else had detected. The smile of a woman who had spent her life finding hidden things, and had never found anything as hidden or as worth finding as this. "You're welcome," she said. "Now go home and sleep, if your kind sleeps. I have never been clear on that. We do not sleep. Then go home and lie down and close your eyes and pretend. It is what I do when I cannot sleep, and it works surprisingly well for a strategy based entirely on self-deception." He left. He descended through the passage. He returned to the undercourt. He walked to his chambers, and stood in the doorway, and looked at the room, the desk, the chair, the window that showed nothing, and felt, for the first time, that the room was not a cage. It was a room. Just a room, in a kingdom, beneath a city, where a king who felt everything was about to fight for the right to keep feeling. He lay down on the bed he had not used in 400 years. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep, but he rested. And in the rest, in the quiet, in the dark behind his eyelids, he felt the connection, the thread that ran from his chest to a woman in an apartment 4 miles above, a thread that hummed with the particular frequency of 2 people who had found each other against odds that should have been 0, and had decided, in the face of those odds, to hold on. The blood moon rose. He felt it the way all his kind felt it, in the blood, in the bones, in the deep, ancestral circuits that connected them to the sky they lived beneath but rarely saw. The blood moon was not mystical, it was gravitational. A shift in the Earth's relationship with its satellite, a tidal pull that moved through every creature with old blood and old bones, and a body that had been alive long enough to develop its own relationship with the moon. The arena filled. The grand gallery, 300 feet of carved stone, polished to a mirror finish, lit by phosphorescent moss that had been coaxed into its brightest configuration for the occasion, was packed. Every vampire in the undercourt was there. The balconies were full. The floor was lined with observers standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces lit green by the moss, their eyes reflecting the light with the particular inner glow that marked them as something other than human. Simon Drake entered first. He walked to the center of the arena with the measured confidence of a man who had been planning this moment for longer than most of the people watching had been alive. He was tall, lean, built like a blade, narrow where a blade is narrow, sharp where a blade is sharp, and designed, like a blade, for a single purpose. He wore black, his faction's colors, his faction's statement, and he stood in the center of the arena and looked at the crowd and smiled the architectural smile. The one that said, "I am not doing this for myself. I am doing this for all of you," even though the lie was so thin you could read through it. Ethan entered second. The crowd went quiet. He had changed. Everyone could see it. Everyone who had watched him govern for 2 centuries. The flat expression, the empty eyes, the mechanical precision of a king who made decisions without feeling them, could see that the man walking into the arena was not the same king. This man's eyes were alive. His posture was not the rigid, controlled stance of the sealed Ethan, but something looser, more responsive, the posture of a body, that was connected to the mind, directing it, and the heart beating inside it. He moved differently. He breathed differently. He occupied space differently, not as a figure in a room, but as a presence, a living presence, radiating the particular intensity of a person who has been absent from himself for 2 centuries and has come back. Simon saw the change. Peter, watching from the eastern balcony, saw Simon see it, the flicker of recalculation behind the architectural smile, the moment of assessment, the rapid adjustment of expectations. Simon had expected a broken king, a man mid-collapse, his seal failing, his emotions uncontrolled, his capacity compromised by the chaotic re-entry of 200 years of suppressed feeling. That was not what he saw. What he saw was a king who had already survived the collapse. A king who had sat in a room and felt every drop of 200 years of grief and rage and love, and had come through the other side, not broken, but rebuilt, different, stronger, unpredictable in the most dangerous way possible, the way of a person who has nothing left to hide. Maggie stood on the western balcony. She watched Ethan take his position in the arena, center floor, 10 paces from Simon, exactly as the ritual prescribed. She watched his hands. They were still, no trembling, no shaking, still and loose and ready. "He is going to try to break him emotionally," she said to Peter, through the communication channel that ran between the balconies. "He will use Grace's name. He will describe the bond severing. He will try to trigger a cascade. Ethan has prepared for that. Preparation is not the same as experience. He has never faced this trigger under combat conditions. He has Lucy." Maggie looked down at the arena. She looked at the edges. She looked at the entrance to the floor level, the narrow corridor that connected the arena to the main passages of the undercourt. "Where is she?" Maggie asked. Peter did not answer, because Peter did not know, because Lucy Harlow had left her apartment 4 hours ago and descended through the passage and entered the undercourt, and then, somewhere between the entrance and the arena, had disappeared. Not disappeared, navigated. She had memorized the corridors over weeks of daily visits, building her map the way she built all her maps, through sound, through touch, through the extraordinary instrument of her attention. She did not need an escort. She did not need directions. She needed the connection, the thread that ran from her palm to his chest, and she followed it the way a compass needle follows north. She was not in the arena. She was beneath it. The Grand Gallery had been built on top of an older structure, a sublevel that housed the mechanical systems that maintained the arena's environment, ventilation, lighting, the moss management networks that kept the phosphorescent organisms alive and glowing. It was a service level, unoccupied during events, accessible through maintenance corridors that no one watched because no one expected anyone to use them. Lucy sat cross-legged on the stone floor of the sublevel, directly beneath the center of the arena, directly beneath the spot where Ethan stood. She placed her hands flat on the stone. She felt his heartbeat through the floor, strong, steady, alive, the heartbeat of a man who felt everything and was choosing to stand in the middle of it. "I'm here," she whispered. 4 miles of stone and air separated her mouth from his ears, and he could not hear her, but the connection, the vein-reader bond, the thread that ran between them, the gift that 3 centuries of eradication had failed to destroy, carried the message through her hands, through the stone, through the floor of the arena, and into the soles of his feet. Ethan felt it. A warmth, rising from the ground, a presence, not visible, not audible, but unmistakable. The specific, particular warmth of Lucy Harlow's hands, reaching him through solid stone, saying the only thing that needed to be said. "You are not alone." The duel began. Simon Drake fought the way he did everything, with precision, with patience, and with the absolute conviction that the outcome had been decided long before the first strike was thrown. He was good. Centuries of training and decades of factional warfare had produced a fighter who wasted nothing. No movement, no energy, no opportunity. He struck where openings existed and created openings where none had been, and he moved across the arena floor with the fluid, economical grace of a creature that had been alive long enough to turn violence into art. Ethan met him. The first exchange was testing. Both fighters measuring distance, reading speed, establishing the language of the fight. Simon struck high, then low, then high again, probing Ethan's guard with combinations that were designed not to land but to inform, to build a model of how the king moved, where he was vulnerable, what patterns his body defaulted to under pressure. Ethan gave him nothing. He moved with a fluidity that surprised even Maggie, watching from the balcony with her hands gripping the railing and her centuries of combat experience screaming that the king was fighting like a different person, because he was a different person. The sealed Ethan had fought like a program, effective, efficient, predictable. This Ethan fought like a weather system. Every movement connected to an emotion, every emotion feeding a decision, every decision arriving not from logic, but from the integrated, full-spectrum awareness of a body and mind operating at complete capacity for the first time in 200 years. The crowd was silent. Vampires did not cheer at challenges. The ritual was too old, too significant, too close to the fundamental nature of their species for the indignity of spectator noise. They watched. They bore witness. And what they witnessed, in the first 3 minutes of the duel, was a king who moved with a speed and precision that exceeded anything they had seen from him in their lifetimes. Simon recalculated. Peter saw it from the balcony. The moment of adjustment, the strategic pivot, the shift from physical combat to the weapon he had always intended to use. She had brown hair, Simon said. He said it mid-exchange, between strikes, his voice carrying across the arena with the casual precision of a man making conversation over dinner. The words were designed to sound offhand, incidental, a throwaway comment that happened to contain a nuclear payload. Ethan did not falter. He blocked Simon's follow-up strike, countered, pressed forward. His face did not change. Grace, Simon continued, circling, maintaining distance. She had brown hair, and she read French novels, and she sat on the floor of your library because she thought chairs were too formal for fiction. I know this because I watched her, for months, before the order was given. The arena held its breath. Every vampire in the gallery knew what Simon was doing. Every vampire understood the strategy: provoke the unsealed king, trigger the grief cascade, exploit the emotional vulnerability that Simon had engineered 200 years ago specifically for this purpose. Ethan advanced. His strikes were harder now, faster, sharper, carrying a force that sent vibrations through the stone floor every time Simon blocked. The emotions were there. Lucy could feel them from beneath the arena, her hands pressed to the stone, reading the fight through the floor the way she read everything, through touch and vibration, and the extraordinary sensitivity of a gift that had survived 3 centuries of attempted destruction. She felt the anger, she felt the grief, she felt the specific, targeted pain of hearing Grace's name from the mouth of the man who had ordered her death. She also felt something else. Beneath the anger and the grief, running through Ethan's body like a current through a wire, she felt determination. Not the cold, mechanical determination of the sealed king, a living determination. The determination of a man who had felt the worst thing a person can feel, the full, unfiltered weight of 200 years of loss, and had chosen to keep standing. Simon pressed harder. The bond severing was exquisite, he said, and his voice was calm, conversational. The voice of a man discussing architecture, or wine, or any other subject that did not involve the deliberate destruction of another person's capacity to feel. I was told it took 3 hours, that you screamed for the first 2, and went silent in the 3rd. That the silence was worse. Ethan's jaw clenched. His eyes flickered. Not black, not the full void of the unsealed response, but a darkening, a deepening, the visual evidence of emotions moving through him, at a volume that would have collapsed the seal if the seal still existed. He did not collapse. He did not falter. He did not stop moving. He felt it, all of it, the memory of the severing, the scream, the silence. Simon's words opened the memory like a hand opening a wound, and the pain was there, real and present and enormous, and Ethan held it the way Lucy had taught him to hold it, not fighting, not suppressing, not locking it away, holding it, carrying it, letting it exist alongside his determination and his anger and his love, all of it present, all of it real, all of it fueling a body that was operating at a capacity Simon had not anticipated, because Simon had spent 3 centuries in the company of sealed emotions, and had no frame of reference for what an unsealed king looked like at full power. "You talk too much," Ethan said, and hit him. The strike landed clean, a blow to Simon's left side that sent the faction leader sliding across the polished stone floor, his feet leaving trails in the surface like skates on ice. Simon caught himself, stabilized, and for the first time since the duel began, his architectural smile faltered. Not because of the pain. Pain was manageable, expected, part of the calculation. Because of the speed. The strike had been faster than anything in Simon's model, faster than the sealed king had ever moved, faster than should have been possible for a man who had been operating at suppressed capacity for 2 centuries and had only been unsealed for 3 weeks. The seal had been a dam. Ethan's emotional energy, the vast, accumulated force of 400 years of life and 200 years of compressed feeling, had been pooled behind it, growing, pressurizing, building potential energy the way water builds behind a dam. And now the dam was gone, and the energy was released, and Simon Drake was standing in the path of a river that had been held back for 2 centuries and was now flowing at full force. Simon changed tactics. He stopped talking about grace. He stopped trying to trigger the grief cascade. He fought, purely, desperately, with the focused intensity of a man who has realized that the fight he prepared for is not the fight he is in. Ethan pressed forward. He felt everything. Every strike he landed, he felt. Every blow he absorbed, he felt. The pain was real. The exhaustion was real. The fear of losing was real. And all of it was fuel. All of it was information. All of it was the lived experience of a body and mind functioning as a unified system, for the first time since a woman he loved was taken from him, and he decided that the only way to survive was to stop being the person who lost her. He was not that person anymore. He was not the sealed king. He was not the hollow ruler. He was something new, something forged in the specific, terrible, beautiful furnace of 3 weeks of unsealed grief and anger and love, held together by the hands of a blind woman who had never been afraid of what she found inside him. Beneath the arena, Lucy felt the shift. Her hands on the stone read the vibrations of the fight the way a seismograph reads earthquakes. Every impact, every movement, every emotional wave that moved through Ethan's body and into the floor and through the stone and into her palms. She felt him winning. Not in the physical sense. She could not track positions or calculate advantages from below, but in the emotional sense. She felt the grief move through him without drowning him. She felt the anger fuel his strikes without consuming him. She felt the love, the old love, Grace's love, the love that had survived 200 years of solitary confinement in a sealed heart. She felt it rising, not as pain but as purpose. He was fighting for the right to feel, for the right to be broken open and still stand, for the right to be a king who wept and raged and loved and missed the sky and approved marriage petitions because he could feel, now, what it meant to want to be with someone enough to build a life around them. Simon Drake was not fighting for any of those things. Simon Drake was fighting for a crown, and a crown, it turned out, was not enough. The final exchange lasted 12 seconds. Simon attacked with everything, a combination designed to overwhelm, to exhaust, to force Ethan into a defensive position where the emotional weight he carried would become a liability rather than an asset. It was a good strategy. It was the strategy of a man who had studied his opponent for decades and had built his entire approach around a single assumption. That feeling was weakness. Ethan did not defend. He moved into the attack. He felt Simon's strikes land, shoulder, ribs, forearm, and he absorbed them, not blocked, absorbed. He let the pain in. He let it join the grief and the anger and the love and the fear and the determination, and he let the full, unified force of all of it flow through his body and into his fists, and he struck Simon Drake once, cleanly, precisely, in the center of his chest, with a blow that carried 200 years of unfelt everything behind it. Simon flew backward, his body left the ground, crossed 10 feet of polished stone, and hit the arena wall with a sound that echoed through the grand gallery like the closing of a very old, very heavy book. He did not get up. He was alive. The blow had not been designed to end life. It had been designed to end the fight, and it did. Simon Drake lay against the wall of the grand gallery, with his eyes open and his smile gone, and his centuries of planning collapsed around him like a house, built on the assumption that a river would never break free of its dam. The arena was silent. Ethan stood in the center of the floor with his chest heaving, and his eyes alive and his hands, both of them, both steady, neither one trembling, at his sides. He looked at Simon Drake. He looked at the man who had killed Grace, who had ordered the eradication of the vein readers, who had engineered 200 years of emotional imprisonment, and then waited, patient as stone, for the opportunity to capitalize on the damage he had done. Ethan felt the urge to end it. Not in the administrative sense, in the permanent sense. 200 years of rage, 200 years of grief, for Grace, the knowledge of Lucy's ancestors destroyed, all of it, pointed at the man on the ground with the force and clarity of an arrow notched and drawn. He did not release it. He stood in the arena with the full weight of 200 years of feeling pressing against the inside of his chest, and he made a choice. Not a sealed choice, not a mechanical decision based on logic and precedent. A felt choice, a choice that carried the weight of everything he had experienced, and everything Lucy had taught him, and everything the last 6 weeks had broken open and rebuilt. Exile, Ethan said. His voice carried through the silent gallery. Every vampire heard it. Every vampire understood what it meant, not just the sentence, but the choice. A sealed king would have executed Simon Drake. A sealed king would have signed the order without hesitation, without feeling, without the burden of empathy or the weight of mercy. Execution was the logical outcome. Execution was the precedent. Ethan was done making sealed decisions. Simon Drake is exiled from this court and all allied territories. His faction is dissolved. His holdings are redistributed. He leaves tonight and does not return. He paused. I am done making doors out of things that should stay open. The sentence landed in the grand gallery like a stone dropped into deep water. The ripples moved outward, through the crowd, through the court, through the political architecture of a kingdom that had been governed by an empty king for 2 centuries, and was now, for the first time, being governed by a full one. Peter Finch stood on the eastern balcony, with tears on his face. He had not cried in 300 years. He did not attempt to stop. He let the tears fall and watched the king, his friend, the man he had served through sealing and silence and 2 centuries of performed governance, stand in the center of the arena, with his emotions visible on his face, for the entire court to see. Maggie Cole stood on the western balcony, with her arms crossed, and her jaw set, and her eyes bright, with something she would later deny was emotion, and everyone who saw it would know was pride. Below the arena, Lucy Harlow sat with her hands on the stone and felt everything. She felt the fight end. She felt the decision. Exile, not execution. Mercy as a choice, rather than mercy as a weakness. She felt the crowd's response, not cheering. Vampires did not cheer, but a shift, a collective exhale, the sound of a people recognizing that something fundamental had changed in their king, and therefore in their world. She felt Ethan, his heartbeat through the stone, strong, steady, alive. She pressed her hands harder against the floor and smiled in the dark beneath the arena, surrounded by maintenance corridors and ventilation systems and the mechanical infrastructure of a kingdom she had not known existed 8 weeks ago. And she felt, through the stone, through the connection, through the gift that had survived 3 centuries of attempted destruction, the specific, unmistakable warmth of a heart that was finally, fully open. The weeks after the blood moon were different. Not dramatically, not in the way stories often insist. The grand transformation, the visible before and after, the world remade, in a single decisive moment. The changes were slower than that, quieter, the kind of changes that happen when a building's foundation shifts an inch and everything above it adjusts, imperceptibly, over months. Ethan governed differently. The decisions were still precise, still informed, still measured. He had not forgotten how to think. But the thinking was filtered through something new. He listened to petitions and felt the weight of the petitioners' lives behind their words. He settled disputes and considered not just the legal merits but the human, the personal, cost of his verdicts. He attended council sessions and stayed after, talking with members, asking questions that had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with the specific, ordinary concerns of people who lived in a kingdom beneath the earth and wanted what every person wants: to be seen, to be heard, to be governed by someone who understood that governance was not an abstraction, but a relationship. He mourned Grace, publicly, for the first time in 200 years. He held a memorial, not a ceremony. He did not want spectacle. A gathering, in the library, where Grace had sat on the floor reading French novels, where he had sat beside her, because the floor was where she was. He stood in that room and spoke about her, not the bond, not the loss, not the ceiling, her, the woman, the brown hair, the laugh that sounded like a question, the way she mouthed words in languages she was still learning. He wept. The court did not know what to do with a king who wept. They had never seen it, 200 years of governance by a man who did not feel, and now the same man stood in a library, with tears on his face, talking about a woman who had been dead for 2 centuries, and the court watched and did not know where to look or what to say. Peter stood in the back of the room. He did not need to be close. He had heard these stories before, centuries ago, in the time before the seal, when Ethan talked about Grace, the way people talk about the air they breathe, with love and wonder, and the bewildered gratitude of a person who cannot believe their luck. Maggie stood by the door. She guarded it, not because she expected a threat, but because guarding was her language, and this was her way of saying, "I am here." Lucy was not at the memorial. She stayed in her apartment, on the surface, with Decimal and her tea, and the particular privacy of a woman who understood that this grief was not hers to witness. It belonged to Ethan, it belonged to Grace, and it needed to exist in its own space, without the complication of a new connection, without the confusion of a living warmth in a room dedicated to a dead love. She would be there later. She would always be there later. But this moment was not hers, and she respected it by being absent. They built something, not a bond, not in the vampire sense, not the cellular, molecular, structural interweaving that Ethan had shared with Grace. Lucy was human. A vein reader, yes, but human. And Ethan was not looking for another bond. He was not looking for a replacement. Grace was not replaceable, and the space she had occupied in his body was not available for rent. What they built was different, something without a name, something that existed in the space between her warmth and his cold, between her hands and his chest, between the last vein reader and the king she had unsealed. It was a connection that required a new vocabulary. Neither romantic love nor friendship nor professional relationship nor any of the other categories that humans and vampires had invented to organize their attachments. It was simply this: she could feel him, and he could feel her, and the connection was permanent and specific, and did not require a label to be real. Lucy kept her apartment. She kept her clinic. She kept her Tuesday soup and her audiobooks, and her cat, and her small, precise life above the laundromat on Hester Street. She visited the undercourt. Ethan visited the surface. They sat in her kitchen, or his chambers, and talked, or did not talk, and her hands found the places in his body where the old grief still lived, because it would always live there, because grief does not leave, it simply changes shape, and she held those places with the steady, patient pressure of a woman who had spent her life finding fractures and had found, in this man, the deepest and most beautiful fracture of them all. She continued to treat patients. She continued to find the injuries that X-rays missed and the tensions that doctors overlooked. But she treated them differently now. She treated them with the knowledge of what she was, the last vein reader, the last carrier of a gift that had been engineered to find the hidden things in hidden people. And the knowledge changed her hands. Not her technique, her intention. She touched her patients, knowing that her touch was not ordinary, that her hands carried an inheritance she had not asked for, and could not refuse, and would not trade for anything. Dr. Adler noticed. "You are different," he said one morning, watching her work on a patient with a chronic shoulder issue that had resisted treatment for months. Better different, or worse different? Better, dramatically. Your hands are, I do not know how to describe it. You were always good, now you are something else. I found my people, Lucy said, and smiled, because the sentence was true in ways that Dr. Adler could not possibly understand. The court adjusted. It took time. A king who felt was a new experience for everyone involved. The advisors, the faction leaders, the citizens who had grown accustomed to a ruler who operated like a very efficient machine, and now operated like a person. Some preferred the machine, most did not. Eleanor Voss, the northern faction leader, was the first to officially endorse the new Ethan. She did it in her own way, not with a declaration or a public statement, but with a bottle of wine sent to the king's chambers, accompanied by a note that said, "You remind me of someone I served 500 years ago." He was also foolish enough to feel. He was the best king I ever knew. Marcus Webb followed, pragmatic as always, supporting the winning side with the comfortable inevitability of a man who had made a career out of accurate timing. Christine Reed, the silent one, the one who had left Simon Drake's meeting without a word, appeared in Ethan's study one evening, unannounced, and sat in the chair across from his desk and said, "I came to tell you that I voted against the eradication protocol 300 years ago. I was outvoted. I have carried that vote for 3 centuries. I would like to stop carrying it." Ethan looked at her. He felt, actively, deliberately, with the full emotional capacity that Lucy's hands had restored, the weight of what this woman was telling him. 300 years of guilt, delivered in 3 sentences, in a chair, in a study. "Consider it set down," he said. Christine nodded. She stood. She left. And Ethan sat in his study with the emotional residue of that conversation, living in his chest, the way all conversations lived in his chest now. Present, felt, carried, not sealed away but held, the way a person holds a cup of something hot, with both hands and careful attention. Months passed, the court stabilized, the exile held, Simon Drake disappeared into the territories beyond the court's jurisdiction, and Maggie's intelligence network tracked him without incident, and the threat diminished from active to latent, from a fire to an ember, from an ember to a memory of warmth in a place that was now cold. Ethan sat at his desk. He read reports. He signed documents. He governed. And between the reports and the documents and the governance, he paused. He looked at his hands, both still, both steady, both warm enough now that the cold of the old king felt like a distant memory, and he breathed. All the way down. On a Tuesday evening in early autumn, Lucy arrived at his chambers for a session. She sat cross-legged on the stone floor. He sat across from her. She placed her hands on his chest, over the place where the seal had been, and felt. No lock, no wall, no dam, no compressed grief, no hidden love, just a heart, beating its slow, deep rhythm, alive and open, and carrying everything it was supposed to carry. "How does it feel?" she asked. It was the question she asked every session. The same words, the same tone, the same gentle, professional, endlessly curious inquiry of a woman who had dedicated her hands to the project of understanding what lived inside other people. "Everything," he said. He said it every time. The same word, the same tone, the same honest, slightly overwhelmed admission of a man who had lived for 400 years and spent 200 of them not feeling, and was now, daily, hourly, minute by minute, discovering what it meant to be fully alive, in a body that could feel everything. Lucy smiled. "Good," she said. Decimal jumped into Ethan's lap. The cat circled once, settled, and purred. The sound filled the stone chamber with its small, warm, thoroughly ordinary music, and the king of the undercourt sat on the floor of his study with a cat on his lap and a blind woman's hands on his chest, and felt, through the stone walls and the ancient corridors and the phosphorescent moss and the carved ceiling that looked like a sky, the full, ungovernable, magnificent weight of being alive. It was enough. It had always been enough. He just had to remember how to feel it.